indoor policy. You're very safe.
All right.
And
Is it
I
that?
Googled it.
You're now live. You're now live.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, I believe we have a quorum here, and we will now display the agenda and get this rolling here. Okay, welcome everyone. We are now live. We should be recording as well as openly broadcasting the Thursday, April 15th, 7 p.m. Planning Commission meeting, which this is. Thank you everyone for your attendance. The agenda is displayed for tonight on your screens. And if you're unable to see it for some odd reason, we will try to voice as many things as possible for those who may have visual aid issue. So call this meeting to order. Roll call. Tammy, please.
Sale,
Here.
Mr. Klein,
Present.
Ms. Butler,
Here.
Mr. Imes,
Here.
Mr. Waltman.
All right, looks like we have quorum. We have 4 out of the 5 existing commissioners, and there's still 2 open positions that are being filled by the mayoral office through the city council. All right, we'll move on to item C, which is approval of minutes from April 1st, 2021 meeting. I had some very slight changes to an opening paragraph, as well as Ms. Diane Butler, our commissioner, wanted to make sure that her vote was recorded in a 4-to-1 vote on the cannabis recommendation by our commission. So let me get to that item. Lay that for us.
And has the vote of 4-to-1 been corrected? The version I have shows 4-0.
I'll show you everything in this version that I'm showing you here on the screen is the same as what the previous 2 emails you would have received on the item, except for going down to where I show my yellow here for the introductory page. For the recommendations, a slight changing of the first sentence from being the Planning Commission generally supports this legislation to the Planning Commission did not fully support this legislation as written and found upon the majority vote that if this legislation was to be passed by the council with respect to cannabis dispensaries, it should consider the following for amendment. And then we go into what we had talked about that evening. So I don't believe too big of a change, but a slight verbiage issue to make it more clear how we stood on the item before we got to the 4-1 vote.
So Ben, you jumped from the minutes to the findings. I'm sorry.
You know what I did, didn't I? Thank you, Tammy, because I'm eagerly trying to get through the agenda.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, I totally jumped one. So let's belay my last for the last minute. Thank goodness that it's been any longer.
And to answer your question, Mr. Klein, we did change it to 4-1. And Ms. Butler, I apologize. I didn't hear that you voted against it. So I changed it to, changed it to 4-1. And then I put that you dissented so that we would have that in the record. And thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Great. Did everyone see that I added my reasoning for my dissent? If not, I can read it quickly.
Yeah, I didn't see it in the minutes. Did you want to include it in the minutes?
Yeah, I sent a copy around with my, I said I voted against and here's why. And I added it at 1, 2, 3, the 4th paragraph towards the end. I put Ms. Butler was persuaded by Alderman Pindell Charles's arguments related to past historical discriminatory practices that has resulted in certain wards bearing the brunt of our worst zoning, and that the comprehensive plan clearly calls for zoning that preserves and enhances community character, which this new use would not. And then that was it.
You know, Ms. Butler, I did not see that because when I read your email from your email's text, I assumed that all you wanted to change was the vote number at the bottom. So I apologize. I did not read that. And so now that I will open that back up and include that because I like what you just said.
Okay,
so
thanks.
I
should have attached it. If I didn't, I apologize. I thought I did.
You made an attachment, but when I read your email statement said basically all I did was change 5 to 0 to 4 to 1. And it didn't say you.
In the version that Tammy sent around.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't see it I didn't see it. So was it on one of the?
So I will bring it up. Just give me a second here.
Let's see. I think I sent it. Yesterday? Let's see.
April 14th, 5:04 p.m.
Thank you.
Aha, there it is. Okay, Diane, yes, the and why, I should have included that because you clearly stated in your email that I should have done it. My apologies. So let me get that out.
So all we have to do is vote on it and,
Yeah, I'm going to display it real quick and I'll show my sentence and then yours, and we'll add the two and vote on it as that. And if people don't like it, we can talk about it after the motion is made. So actually, I'll go ahead and display it first. And we'll make the motion. So give me another 20 seconds. It's opening.
hey, Julian,
Yes.
I just got a text and I think Alderman Arnett would love
Yeah.
to be able to join
I
in.
see him now.
Okay.
Thank you, Diane and Julian.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Arnett, for joining. We'll try to share this.
Hey, Ross, long time no see.
Yeah, I know. I only wish Dewan were here.
Okay, we have two parts of those. Actually, it's like I jumped ahead to the findings. We should go back to the minutes first. So I've got that ready to go. So let's go back to the minutes. Okay, hopefully you can see that the April 1st minutes. And we'll scroll through these.
Ben, did you have any changes that you want incorporated?
I didn't, but I'm showing it real quickly for everyone so we can roll through it.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any changes they want to show for the minutes other than what Ms. Butler has written right here?
I think it's fine, except for the, I would remove the parenthetical at the end.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Not
We
really
don't need a
meaningful
reference.
in this context, that's all.
Yep.
And obviously the 4 to 5 was should be 4 to 1. And you know what we don't have, what we had hoped for before was the comments being for or against for items. So if we could include or neutral.
So,
Future.
yeah, well, they, because sometimes it's hard when you're reading those to understand whether they're for or against. So
Yes.
that would require either staff or someone from the planning commission to kind of, I can take a stab at it and then.
Well, you're reading my mind. It's almost like, is that one thing a bridge too far? Because, you're kind of deciding for that person instead of letting someone else read for it. But it does make a nice summary if they're definitely for or against, if they state it, or undetermined.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, it'd
What do
be
you say,
kind of
Dave?
nice to.
Sometimes they're just commenting and
Right.
And it's
they
hard
say
to
some
tell.
negative things and some positive things, and it's like, which
Hard
do you
to
take?
tell. Right, and that's why I didn't want to put those in the official minutes and make the assumption and then it be incorrect and it be a problem because they get posted.
All right, we'll leave it as is then. That's a good enough argument for me to continue on. I have no further changes for the minutes. Does anyone else? Make a motion that we pass the minutes as written.
Second,
Is this motion a second? Any further discussion?
Is it as written or as modified?
As written here, which is the modification from the previous one. So yes, as modified, written here. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Okay, looks like it passes. Thank you very much. We'll get past the minutes and on to the next item.
Fine.
Okay, we have we're going on to the next item, which is the findings for the medical cannabis dispensaries and summary. Made no recommendation of the summary as was given by planning and zoning. Very nice. The only thing I would have liked that we could have done maybe in the future by the city council is a better detailed map of, with a little bit of different coloring. So we can work on that in the future, but that's what we had displayed to us, and that's why we included it. Going down to the recommendations. That's the only, I wanted to change the intro sentence to read that way. If anybody has a problem with it, let me know.
Should we be adding Ms. Butler's reasoning in?
Reasoning was in the minutes, but we could also, her reasoning is not part of the recommendation of us as a, I could put my reasoning for voting for this recommendation. And so we would all have to further detail our reasonings. The point is what is the recommendation of the commission as a whole? What do we vote on? And whether you like it or not, this is as minimal as it gets to what we could come to agreement on, right?
I agree.
Make sense, Dave?
Ms. Butler can say it at the city council meeting if she really wants to push it out there a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, you understand what I'm saying. It's like, what can we all agree upon is what's in the
Right.
application.
It's not important to have my dissent in this. I agree.
Well, your dissent isn't there. Well, maybe it's not, but you're right. His findings should say 4 to.
Yes, and at the bottom, we go to change to 4 to 1 right here,
So that's fine.
right there.
It's there. Your dissent's there.
Yep, the dissent's there, and this is what we could agree upon as recommendations.
No, that's good.
Because then we'd have to put, I'd want to put in more verbiage myself, well, why did I vote for this recommendation? So everybody can understand. The reason why I changed the first sentence is because the first sentence leaned towards the planning commission generally supports this legislation. Say, well, did we really generally support it? I don't think that was the feeling. We didn't generally support it as it was written. So I wanted to definitely delineate that as written, we had some issue and we found common ground upon this.
Exactly.
Any issue with that? Anyone?
I make a motion to approve the findings
As amended.
as amended.
I'll make a second for that motion. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, it passes.
And Ben, that's the same version you sent this afternoon, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Exactly. the
And
same.
is it okay with you if I sign for you?
Absolutely.
All right.
You're
thank
probably
you.
better than me anyway to sign my own name.
Oh, I signed my name for you. So.
Exactly. For Cameron's got it, because you need a physical signature with ink. I understand. All right, thank you very much. We are moving on. All right, now we've gone through items A, B, C, and D. On to new business, Maritime Task Force update. And I will stop share and give it over to the Maritime Task Force representation. Please introduce yourselves for the public and we'll go from there. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and introduce for the public while she's getting ready. Miss Eileen Fogarty will be presenting for the Maritime Task Force.
Thank you so much. And while Julian is bringing the presentation up, first of all, thank you so much for taking time to hear about the progress and the many areas of agreement from the Maritime Task Force. Tonight, you'll be hearing from Wendy O'Sullivan, who's the superintendent for the National Park Service for Chesapeake Bay, Pete McDevitt, Mike Tomasini, Susan Zellers, John Hammond, Rod Jabin, Will Scott, and of course, your highly competent planning department, Dr. Nash, Eric Lashinsky, and Stephen Rice. We would just ask that you let the presenters make their comments because I think they'll answer a lot of your questions. And we will open this up for what I'm sure will be a robust discussion as soon as they all have shared their perspectives. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to the next slide and Dr. Nash.
Thank you all for having us here tonight. It's been great working with Eileen on this task force. It's great to see how she works and manages to forge consensus when despair had just about to settle in. And we really have worked together to come up with many points that we agree on. We began this study after Alderman Arnett introduced his legislation. We're interested in helping the Maritime District, but we wanted to get feedback from a broad range of stakeholders, property owners, tenants, and residents to make sure that together we could agree on how we would help the industry go forward. Next page. So we're coming up with a cohesive strategy for the maritime districts. We're balancing all the expectations of these different groups and working really hard to build consensus. We want to let you know tonight the progress that we've made so far, and hopefully you'll hear and be excited by the work that we've done so far. Bob Waldman, who is apparently in Mexico right now, has been a valuable member of the Maritime Task Force representing the Planning Commission. So it's a shame he couldn't be here, but he has helped greatly with thinking about different kinds of uses and how we can be more flexible in the Maritime District without compromising the industry. Next slide.
Dr. Nash, thank you. The basis of this whole maritime strategy, the current one and what you will see in the items that we're bringing forward to you this evening, it's based on the concept of triggers. We use that term, and I'm not sure that everyone really is clear about what the thought process was when they were initially instituted. The idea behind the triggers is that there are aspects of the industry that are critical to the rest of the industry. A boatyard, as you would see here, a 30-ton working lift, 25,000 square feet of on-land boat storage as you have it, Templetons. These elements of the industry create the hub around which all of the services and many of the working uses depend. So the initial idea behind triggers was that, and this was again in 1987, that in the WMM, which is the Spa Creek district, the Eastport side, that you had these uses that were essential, and the community wanted to make sure that these uses could be supported. So in WMM, there was an allowance for 30% non-maritime. The thought process was non-maritime will bring higher rents, non-maritime will in essence serve as for the property owner to help subsidize these other critical uses. And that's the concept of the triggers that you're going to see as we go forward tonight. Triggers were never intended to increase non-maritime uses across the board. These districts are maritime. That's their purpose. That's what they are. Slips have always been profitable, and slips were never seen as a use that needed additional support to keep it. So slips were not something, because you may hear over the next month or two from people, well, why don't we use slips as a trigger? Slips are basically a profit. They are not a use that needs to be subsidized. So that is the concept behind the triggers. And tonight, as you'll hear from the task force, they will be recommending adding fuel dock, fuel pumping station to the triggers, but keeping the triggers significant activities that the rest of the industry is dependent upon. Next slide, please. The commission has met with us in February, and there were many areas of agreement, incentivizing water access, any flexibility being tied to these working yards, programs to promote the industry. So tonight, what you will hear is a lot more detail and specific recommendations on each of these ideas. Next slide. We also, in addition to meeting and hearing from the Planning Commission, we had a work session with the council, with both the Ward 7 civic associations as well as the Eastport Civic Association. And then within the task force itself, the working groups have gotten into real detailed work sessions on a whole range of topics. Bob Waldman's group has focused on water access. Other groups have focused on the industry or restaurants. Next slide, please. So where we are this evening, if you look at this diagram, we are the third orange circle from either the right or the left. After we meet with the Planning Commission, get your thoughts, we also will be reaching back out to the civic associations, and then in May, we'll be going up to have a work session with council. Next slide, please. So the important part of the presentation now is that you hear from each of the stakeholders, and I'd like to turn this next slide over to Pete McDevitt to talk about the residents' perspectives. Pete?
Thank you, Eileen. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Pete McDevitt. I am a resident here in Annapolis, living on King George Street, and also a frequent sailor of the waters around here in Annapolis. I think we realize that the success of the mission of this maritime group is having the residents behind all these different initiatives. The water is a large, I'm sure from many of us, is a reason why we live here or moved here. Envisioning a vital future here, let's see, we've got this. We realize the working yards are a very important part of it. They provide the openness to the water there, public access as well, and they are the only thing really that ties us to the past maritime heritage and industry of this area. The working yards are also land intensive, but nevertheless they are compatible with sea level rise, something that of course we are dealing with now and are going to deal with, I'm sure, for many decades to come. They help maintain that critical mass, that minimum amount of something that allows the industry and the working maritime activity to flourish, hopefully for years and maybe decades to come. The residents we don't envision that more hotels or development of residents along the waterfront are part of the mission going future. It doesn't seem to support the maritime industry if we do that. What we would like to see is expanded water access, perhaps incentivizing water access activities that you might hear about a little later on in terms of funding and other initiatives. Providing benefit to the community so that the community also can enjoy the waterfront, perhaps with something such as a promenade that other cities have managed to do. Creating a network of connecting activities at street and parks there via boats, probably water taxis or whatever. But again, giving people a destination and making them aware of what else exists in the area around here, not just in the downtown, Eagle Alley area, that's such as that. And then public access at the city-owned properties and developing that some more. Next slide, please. As residents contributing to it now, what can we do? Well, we can look to address parking issues throughout. It's always been a contentious issue, whether you're on this side of Spot Creek or the other side of Spot Creek. Incentives to allow to find that balance between resident and businesses is always it's always important, of course. And for the WME, the WMM, the WMI, it might be nothing more than extending the parking program we have over here where I live with the annual parking passes, monthly temporary passes, something like that, that helps strike that balance between residents and businesses, and at the same time provides perhaps a revenue stream for the city. Restaurants in the WMI is something we are looking at or talking about. Boatyards in particular over there. There isn't a lot of presence in terms of restaurants, which would contribute to the workers over in those yards, as well as perhaps attract others, the public, the general public, to enjoy the waterfront and see a little of the maritime industry as it is there. There are triggers that would be involved with such as that, and limits on the size of these restaurants that will be discussed a little bit later as well. And we want these restaurants, like you say, to accommodate and not to disrupt the working maritime activities. Thank you.
Great, Pete, thanks so much. Next slide, Wendy O'Sullivan.
Good evening, all. Wendy O'Sullivan, I'm the superintendent for MPS Chesapeake. I've been really just feel fortunate to have been part of the water access subgroup team. We have really together looked at the opportunities, the barriers, and the potential to expand equitable access to our waterfront. And Mike's going to share, some of the focus and priorities that we have related to that. But before I turn it over to Mike, I just want to share that the NPS and Chesapeake Gateways has been listening and is really committed to supporting Annapolis as you move forward here. And so I'd like to just share that we are talking with the city in our new partnership that we're working on about bringing Gateways funding forward to do a more comprehensive, purposeful study to look at water access and do a major comprehensive water access plan. But actually, I think the exciting part is to really even expand a little bit beyond that, so that we're really thinking about how we're connecting our communities in really, I guess you could call it an intermodal sense. And so, in the way that the MPS our funding for Chesapeake Gateways works, this is going to be something that we'll be looking to bring forward this fall. And so this effort and that timeline that Eileen showed is really lining up well to prepare and line up for that. So we're excited to partner with the city on an effort like this, bring in an outside firm that will help us really connect all these dots that you see on this map. And the team has been really effective in getting us and teeing us up to be to take that next big step together. So I'll just end there and say I'm looking forward to continuing to support the effort and pass it to Mike.
Thanks, Wendy. It's really been great to have your support and your insight as a member of the team, as it has been to have Bob Waldman in my group as well. A lot of the things that we've discussed have, in our group especially, have been more resident or community focused than industry specific. My wife and I own and operate a charter boat out of Eastport. We're tenants in one of the maritime zones, and I live on Eastern Avenue, both adjacent to and across the street from maritime zone property. So it's something that, you know, ties into all aspects of my life. And we've been really, really careful about making sure that if we're going to try and find a common sense solution for the property owners and support the industry at the same time, we don't want to leave the residents and the surrounding community out of the solution. So some of the things that we've been talking about, and these have been, you know, since the very beginning, probably since we started in December, have been how do we make the water access pieces in the maritime zones more visible to the public? How do you know whether something is private property or public property? How do you know if you can go up there and throw a line in the water or put your kayak in the water? And we've been talking about inventorying the city-owned properties and the public access points to try and figure out which ones are best for which uses. You know, so one is going to be really good for, you know, putting your toes in the water and watching the boats go by, while another is going to be a really good place for a car top boat launch or, you know, throwing a fishing pole in the water. So those are the things that we've talked about. We've talked about how do we expand on the existing water access opportunities through either new street end parks or improved street end parks where maybe the sites have become grown over or unusable due to flooding or, you know, overgrowth. And then we've talked about the possibility of private-public partnerships. Next slide. We've come up with, or you know, more appropriately, Bob has come up with a slide here that basically talks about what we were trying to do in a way to reward the community for, you know, as a part of this effort. And one of the major talking points right now here in Eastport is water access. How do we maintain a level of water access that's consistent with the community need? And one of those things we talked about was potentially flexibility or incentive for property owners who are willing to commit a major dollar amount to improve a street end park, or to create a high-end community boating facility where residents would be able to store their boats at not in their backyards or underneath their porches, but in a designated rack for community members, even for a small fee, and be able to walk down, access their boat, put it on a floating dock and launch and go for a paddle. And then the third most, obviously, for those of us here in Eastport, is any kind of negative impacts on parking. So we've talked about sites that have a large amount of available parking who might be able to share that with either the local businesses or the residents in a way to mitigate impacts. Eileen talked about before, the Waterfront Promenade is a concept that's been floated quite a bit, and affordable boating, which is, you know, we've kind of categorized it into multiple aspects. One of those things being, you know, what are the easiest ways for people to get on the water without having to own their own boat, whether it's through a tour boat or a water taxi or a paddleboard or kayak rental. Next slide. So these are kind of the concepts that we've been thinking about. This waterfront access, on-water access, if you can imagine this in the city, would be a place where residents would have access to a place to store their boats, to be able to launch it nearby, and then to be able to come back and clean up afterwards. And part of what's falling in there is, you know, dedicated parking for these types of facilities, and to make it truly accessible to people, not only who can walk there, but people who are a little bit further out in other wards in Annapolis to be able to access the water here. Next slide. We've talked a lot about the promenades and the possibilities of, you know, I don't know, the way I think about it is almost a secondary city dock, a site where people can have access to the water that's not necessarily right there at the heart of the city, but in other areas where you might be able to link either private properties or public properties together, sharing private property to be able to access the water in a continuous stretch as opposed to hop from this street end park to that street end park. Next slide.
There you go. I was going to have, Eric, did you want to add anything? Mike does such a terrific job. I think he covered most of it.
Yeah, no, you did a great job, Mike. I think I don't have anything else to add.
Okay, great. Mike, thank you so much. Next slide, Susan Zellers with
I think
Marine.
Wendy wanted to say something, Eileen.
Oh, I just wanted to add, beyond MPS funding to sort of help plan out these visions of opportunities that Mike just shared. As it's passing to Susan Zeller, I just wanted to share the other area that MPS Chesapeake Gateways is really interested in is directly related to the industry through Susan and I have started to talk about opportunities for the MPS to support the on-the-job training programs that her organization and others within the maritime industry are leading and conducting. So I just wanted to share that as well. So it really is about MPS finding opportunities to bring funds that meet some of the planning needs and the opportunities for engaging the next generation in the marine industries.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Susan,
So
next slide.
Let me start with that as well. I'm so excited that Wendy and I have connected and that we hopefully can work to expand our workforce development efforts here in the city. For all of you, we have several of our on-the-job training people housed right here in the city of Annapolis. And Eileen had asked if I would put together some sort of a meet and greet so that you could see how these kids are working. And I call them kids, but they're really 18 to 24-year-olds at the start of their career and in these on-the-job trainings. We have 4 of them right now active in the city of Annapolis, and we'd love to, bring some of you around to meet them and to see this program in action. So now what I'm here to talk about, which is the industry and their perspective in this. And what's grand about this process, and Eileen is our leader, is that the industry and the residents are in full agreement. How often does that happen? So that's all good news. So again, the objective is to ensure a strong future for the boating businesses in the community in the maritime districts. And to understand the importance of this maritime hub that we have built here today and the importance of that to the residents, to the industry, to the owners, it is what makes Annapolis what it is. So in order to make sure we keep that maritime hub, we have to make sure that we support the working yards and the services that make those boats want to stay here. If we were just slips, as we keep telling you, slips alone are not the key. If we were just slips, then eventually that would start to fall off because those boats need the service, they need the storage, they need, all sorts of things. And that's what we do here. And by the way, I did not make all these spelling errors on here. So this was not me. Okay, next slide. So as we move forward, Eileen was talking to you about the triggers and the industry agreed on what these contributing uses and triggers would be. That the uses must support the health of the maritime industry. The uses that we see there cannot be something that doesn't help the maritime to thrive, to survive. And in that way, restaurants are identified as contributing uses. Not only do they feed the folks who are working in the yards, but they also support the slip holders and the boaters that pull into to the different marinas. So restaurants are identified as an excellent contributing use. The triggers that allow for those restaurants or any non-maritime, again, have to be essential. And Eileen covered that pretty well, but with the idea of the lifts and the boat storage, the working yards and the fuel dock, those are the essential components to the strength of the industry. Next slide, please. So as we look for ideas on how to support the industry and see it thrive, we recommend looking at a lot of different angles and things of ways to not only attract additional maritime here and different maritime uses, but also to support what is there. Incentives for new maritime uses or incentives for growing the maritime uses. Relocation assistance if we have a particular target of group that we want to add to our maritime mix. Developing some incubator space for new technologies within the maritime industry or just new ideas and fledglings starting out parts of the industry. Again, expansion of the workforce development efforts to reach more and more of our population. And a commitment from the city to reach out and promote available maritime spaces. So making a sort of an inventory of what we have and using that to reach out to other areas, advertising what Annapolis offers for maritime tenants and boaters. Streamlining the permitting process for certain things like winter maritime activity and routine dock and bulkhead replacement, things that can hold up us being able to continue business. Making sure that we're able to streamline that so that we can stay open and stay working. And a continued exploration of the great work that Stephen Rice has already started on exploring blue technology and how it could fit in to our maritime space that we have and complement our existing industry. Examples like wind turbines, which are a very similar technology to fiberglassing and on boats and that. Next slide will go to John Hammond. He'll tell you how we're going to pay for all this.
Susan, before you do that, let's go back a slide. I was going to have Stephen talk after John, but Stephen, why don't you just add your comments so the commission knows some of the things that you are doing with economic development to help the industry with this slide.
Sure thing. Thank you, Susan and Eileen. What we've done, actually, we hear the industry, and we're trying to be as proactive as possible. A couple of weeks ago, we launched a new webpage on our economic development site to help actually advertise the maritime districts. And we're doing two things. One, we're providing information on the districts, the different types and their characteristics, but we're also listing available properties. And so we're going to obviously tweak this page and grow this page and so forth, but at least we have a landing page. So we have an opportunity to be very proactive in letting folks know where the opportunities lie when it comes to available space. The other thing that we're planning to do post-COVID, when things, or I'll say the dust settles, is we're planning to attend some of the major boat shows on the East Coast that are not held actually in Annapolis, to help raise the profile of the Annapolis maritime industry and to also help with our business recruitment efforts. And then the third thing that we're working on right now is actually, with the development of we're projecting a maritime incentives fund. We're looking at ways to balance efforts that would be, recruitment efforts to bring in new businesses, and then retention efforts to keep the businesses that we have here growing and thriving. So we're excited about the future, and we're excited about maritime in Annapolis, and we want our ecosystem to continue to thrive. So we're here to help. Thank you.
Stephen, thanks so much. Next slide, John Hammond.
Good evening, everyone. As Stephen mentioned, one of the ideas that has percolated through this process is the creation of the Annapolis Maritime Industry Fund. And in order to do that, we need some funding sources. And some of the ideas that we've talked about doing is perhaps creating a sort of a tax increment district from the maritime zone properties. It would be done on a perhaps informal basis where the city would commit to a policy of freezing the assessments on the maritime properties at a date certain, like January 1 of 2021. And then over the years, as the assessments grow, the property taxes from that growth in the assessments would be set aside and be available to fund some of the initiatives of this activity through the Annapolis Maritime Industry Fund. Other thoughts of funding could be from increasing the rental fees at the city dock and the harbor anchorage to visitors that come and visit the city, and also perhaps adding a surcharge on the existing mooring buoys in the various creeks that are used by residents. Another idea that is a possibility is that the county does have authorization for a space permit fee. This is something that could be combined with the non-maritime uses that are permitted to grow beyond the present limits, such that the non-maritime uses that occupy space that have been allowed to expand in the existing maritime districts, that space rental levy could be used to fund the incentive fund also. Other sources, Annapolis and Anne Arundel County Visitors Bureau gets a considerable portion of the hotel taxes generated in the county. That is a potential source of perhaps an ongoing operating grant coming from the Visitors Bureau to especially promote the maritime industry in Annapolis. And then other sources of one-time grants from various organizations like the National Park Service, the Economic Development Operation in the county. Any other source of grants would be another source. We believe that this fund would be a terrific adjunct to promote the success of the maritime industry in Annapolis.
John, such a terrific job. Thank you. And we're going to jump 2 slides to Rod Jabin.
Good evening. I'm Rod Jabin, and most of you are probably familiar with the Jabin Yacht Yard here on Edgewood Road. We're probably the biggest hard maritime operation here in the city of Annapolis, and I'm the 2nd generation operating this facility, so I have a pretty unique perspective on the the zoning and the issues surrounding this. And again, it's important to remember that what we're trying to do is strengthen the industry and make it resilient and able to be sustainable for the next several years. And so with that in mind, some of the uses that we've talked about as a task force that we have broad agreement in is this concept of restaurants. And to begin with, one of the very basic things is let's level the playing field. Anne Arundel County allows restaurants to operate within a marina, and the city of Annapolis is right inside and probably the most important part of Anne Arundel County is when it comes to boating. And I'll give you an example. Here on Edgewood Road, it's the line between the city and the county, and right next door to me, across from Edgewood Road, is Chesapeake Harbor Marina, where they are able to enjoy a modest restaurant with outdoor dining. And in today's marine experience, that's absolutely vital to the operation of the marina. The idea of a destination facility attracts outside boaters, transient boaters, increased slip usage, and it's good for a variety of different reasons. And so what we have broad support in, especially in the WMI, where these are big spaces, our facility alone is over 20 acres. So where we have agreement in the WMI is to support this concept of modest restaurants up to 4,000 square feet that would serve not only the boating public, but also the employees here that work. Probably in our facility alone, we probably employ over 200 people. that work here every day, servicing boats and doing their thing. So it serves a great thing. And like I said before, the most important reason is that in every successful marina up and down the East Coast that you see, one component that continues to pop up is this idea of a restaurant on site. It's kind of complicated with the various zones because what's good for WMI is not necessarily good for WME. An example of that is that the task force has not come to an agreement on allowing restaurants in the WME, perhaps as a conditional use, but there are several resident concerns, and so we still don't have consensus on restaurants in the WME. Next slide, please. The restaurants also, this concept of outdoor dining is huge. You see a couple of pictures in these slides that represent that, but the idea of being able to experience the atmosphere around the water being outside is very, very powerful. And we've seen that time and time again where it's allowed in the WMM, and it's very successful. The other idea about these uses that contribute to the success is to expand and get into the table of uses this idea of outdoor venues. We have more and more demand for corporate get-togethers to experience that on the water atmosphere, for weddings, for other functions, and just want to get that in the use tables and make sure that it's an allowable use. Complementary uses, again, just getting them into the use table so that we're all clear on whether we can do it or not, is the concept of a small format grocery, convenience and provisional stores to service the maritime industry employees, as well as the slip patrons and the people that enjoy the marine facility all year round. The idea of being able to offer maritime civic and social organization space around the water, again, we feel is in high demand and can be taken advantage of. This idea of transient boater services that include pools and recreation and exercise facilities. I mean, more and more the demand for exercise facilities is come on the table, and it's consistent with what we see in the development and the evolution of the marinas, where it's a destination facility. People are coming, they want to stay the entire week or longer at the facility, and they want to be able to go to the restaurant, they want to be able to recreate in pools, and they want to be able to exercise and maintain their fitness. And all of those things are new, basically, and have evolved since the code was written, and we just want to get that out on the use tables. There, as we heard earlier tonight, there is no consensus and no agreement on residential or even commercial inns or hotels or anything else on the maritime zones. We just can't figure out how they fit in very well. Next slide, please. So this idea of triggers, right? It's a little bit complicated. What's very complicated about this whole thing with the maritime zones is that we have 3 maritime zones that are very, very different. Each zone is requiring a little different attention, but we're trying to create some equity across all the zones. So what we have in common is that the triggers, as you've heard people say tonight, are things that we've identified that are critical to a thriving boating industry. Every time you see a postcard or a picture of Annapolis with a boat sailing in the background, the only reason they're able to go out there and do their thing out there is because we have this strong, very powerful service sector that has the 30-ton boat lifts to haul them out of the water, that has the working space to store them on land, that has all the hard maritime activities that keep everything working on a boat, including fueling stations. That's a very important concept because they're just like, cars. You need to put fuel in the boats, and they need to be accessible, and it needs to be easy to get to. So all those are very important triggers that when you come to town on a boat, that's what's important to you. And so that's what we're trying to preserve. But at the same time, as you heard Dr. Nash say initially, we're trying to create more flexibility without compromising the strength of the maritime industry. And one of the things that is especially prevalent is this idea in the WMM, where they really need some additional flexibility with non-maritime. And if we can pair that up with the existing triggers, then as a task force, we have come to consensus with allowing up to 15% more non-maritime use in their properties, as long as the triggers stay in place. And in an effort to create equity across all zones, we're going to extend that 15% to the WME and the WMI. It has much less of an impact on WME and WMI than it does in the WMM zone, because those are mostly professional office space areas. But it's important to create equity across all the zones so nobody feels left out.
Rod, really good statement. I would just like to add, when I spoke with Rod earlier today, so people have a sense, in WMI, you take a large site, 20-acre site like Jabin's Yard, and 15% probably only means about 2,200 square feet. So you're talking about, very small spaces. Whereas if you take an office building like the City Marina, that's 75,000 square feet, 15% is a much larger number. It's over 11,000, but to give people some sense of that. Thank you. The next slide, building on the triggers that Rod just described, incentives for water access are separate and in addition to. The incentives are offered only in conjunction with the type of waterfront access that you heard Mike describe, either game changers like a street end park for $125,000 or a community boating facility, or smaller incentives for the promenade or dedicated slip. The incentives, there's been a tremendous amount of discussion, and the bottom line is that both the residents and the industry, and actually some of the property owners, felt that particularly in WMM, the Eastport side of Spa Creek, that these are maritime districts. They do not want to see these districts become more than 50% non-maritime, because the feeling was then they wouldn't be maritime. So the incentives for water access was identified at 5%. What that translates to is the majority did not want to go above 50% non-maritime for WMM. There was some support for going up to 55%, which would be a 10% incentive, but the majority ultimately came out at a 5% incentive. Next slide. So where does all that leave us? You've got the industry, the residents, the property owners. They have come really to a very wide range of agreements. Next slide. You've heard us talk about the decision they've all made to keep the districts, and to keep the districts primarily and strongly maritime, to keep the concept of the triggers rather than watering the triggers down and having non-maritime throughout the districts, to only with a trigger allowing 15% additional non-maritime, as, if you will, as a subsidy, to support what are called contributing uses such as restaurants on Back Creek. Again, restaurants are allowed in Eastport in WME, but only up to 2,000 square feet. There was not agreement to go any larger. Tremendous support for having a fund and the tax increment financing to do the things that Susan and Stephen described. Support to have a realistic parking ratio. Right now, maritime uses have a higher parking ratio than lawyer's office. And for incentives for water access, an additional 5% incentive would be offered, which would bring the maximum amount of non-maritime uses in WMM to 50%. In the other districts, the maximum, if people use the incentives, would be 20%. And with that, the last slide, and Will Scott is going to wrap this up for you. Dr. Scott.
You'd think I'd learn to unmute myself after all of these Zooms. Thank you to Eileen and to all the others who've made these excellent presentations, and thanks to the Planning Commission, of which I was formerly a member, for giving us the opportunity to speak to you again tonight. Before I say anything else, I would just like to jump off from the wonderful presentations that have already been made and point out that at a time in our civic life when groups like this often devolve into dissension and conflict, this was an impressive group of people representing all the constituencies affected by their concern about the maritime districts, who met repeatedly for many hours and thoughtfully and respectfully shared their ideas and their suggestions for how to preserve something that's been a part of Annapolis since its foundation in 1649. And I think that I was invited to participate partly because I'm so old, that I was actually a member of the Planning Commission when the initial zoning was established and enacted and then utilized during my time on the Planning Commission. And to remind everybody that at that time, it was as fraught and contentious as it is sometimes now, but that the community, the property owners, and the industry business owners came together, and the mariners and those that represented their interests, to forge a consensus that allowed our maritime to continue to exist and be a part of Annapolis until now. But as you've heard in some of the earlier presentations and earlier meetings, there are changes that are constantly taking place. And all of us on the task force, and I hope all of you on the commission, want to see the maritime industry in Annapolis continue to thrive, to go forward into the future healthy and contributing to what makes Annapolis the special place that it is. And I want to sort of jump off from something that Susan said, because it is remarkable to some degree that the industry and the residents are in more or less complete agreement over what needs to be done and how to do it. And the delicate balance that we've worked out in our many meetings is one that I hope you'll consider as you give us your feedback and your input, because the incentives and the triggers that Eileen and Rod and others have touched on have been hard to work out. We believe that they will help us and help the industry move forward. And I hope that you'll see that the goal that I believe we've achieved is a plan to sustain the maritime industry, to encourage its growth and expansion. If we need to review this again, even in a year or two, we'll do that, of course. It's been too long. It's been almost 30 some years since such a substantial review has taken place. We think that we've done a good job. We hope that you'll agree and you'll support our recommendations, and that we will be able to move forward with a healthy, thriving maritime industry, contributing to the experiences that we all value from life in Annapolis, a maritime city. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Will.
I take it as that concludes your brief, Ms. Fogarty?
That does.
Wonderful. The way I'd like to go through this is go by each commissioner if they have questions, but with that, going through the slide deck, starting with slide 2 and 3, and then we'll just go down if anybody's got any questions, and we'll just thumb through it real quick from commissioner to commissioner as we go through slides. That way you don't forget what the questions you had. The slides should bring it back to your mind. So if you could go begin share, please, Eileen, and start. a
Okay,
session.
let's go, Julian, let's go back to the beginning.
And this will, I think it honestly will make it faster, I believe.
Right. Does Julian have the presentation?
I do. I just was going to the beginning and didn't want to force everyone to watch that.
I think, Julian, the meat of it, let's go through kind of quickly.
Yeah, what do you, I'd like to actually have them go from slide to slide, and then we'll ask as commissioners as we go, it'll cage the commissioner's brain. Oh, I had a question here or whatnot, and we'll just run through it. So next slide, if there's no questions from commissioners, the purpose, we get it. It was fantastic. There's a couple of slides in here that don't look too environmentally friendly, and that one and the one before it don't look that great environmentally friendly to me. So just something, maybe choose a different one, but I get it. Some of the slides have pictures that don't even apply. I'm sorry, pictures that don't really apply to the topic, a little bit distracting, but that's just technique. The triggers are a big item here. And I want to hit on that later on in these slides. Does anybody have any questions on triggers at the moment?
Yeah, I actually do. I was curious about the 30-ton lift. I realize now that you can park a 30-ton boat lift in your yard and say, you know, that you're a working boatyard and actually not be a working boatyard at all. And I know of a place where they just painted the the lift black, so it was just not in the view of the condo owners next door, but it hasn't been moved or used in a very long time. So what's to stop that from happening? Just park a 30-ton lift in your, you know, boatyard. You can park under it. You can do anything you want. And it's just a trigger now that you can say, oh, we have it.
Though the 30-ton lift has always been a trigger. A 30-ton lift is, I'm not sure the exact price, but it's a $500,000 investment roughly. And it's an essential part of a boatyard. It's not something that you would not go out and buy a 30-ton lift for $500,000. So that's how that became a trigger in 1987 and remains a trigger.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily have to be used. You can buy one used from, you know, someplace on the Northern Neck, and it's just there.
We can certainly look at the language that exists in the code to make it clearer that obviously it has to be a functioning used 30-ton lift. That's a good observation.
Right, because I mean, I was really appreciative of the fact that people said over and over that we want to maintain our working boatyards, but we have a couple of places where that's, you know, we have promises for working boatyard, but then there's just slips, luxury homes, and they're just waiting so they can change the law in order to get restaurants. And that's not cool, because we do have a lot of maritime people that were involved in supporting these places that were promised jobs and promised they would come back to working boatyards, and they're just disappearing. So I'm just trying to look at the triggers, as my other planning commissioners are as well, to find out, you know, what's real and what's just a sham, you know.
And Sally, what I think we can do is, because again, the 30-ton lift is certainly, if you look at Jabin's or, you know, Scott Tinkler's or any of those yards, or Clarence Blackwell's, it's certainly a very critical part of the boatyard, but we can add some language in to make sure it's not some rusted old lift that's sitting there.
Okay,
I had a similar comment about that. You know, and I think generically, I think you need to think about some sort of standards that define, you know, how these things are used or whatever, just to prevent at least the appearance of a bait and switch.
Yes,
is the concern. So some sort of standards that say, you know, as you mentioned, that has to be, you know, has to be used in such and such a way, or you know, you guys could figure that out, but in a way to show that it's not just theater. That's important.
agree.
And I believe the one you have in the picture there is greater than 30-ton. A greater than 30-ton box crane. Rod Jabin, would you confirm that, you think?
Yeah, that particular lift used to be mine. It's a 35-ton machine, but the 30-ton is a good size. And to Miss Butler's point, you know, we've talked about that exact condition as a task force, and have recommended, you know, language to Dr. Nash to strengthen that provision, because that certainly wasn't the intention when that trigger was developed, that you could put a lift in and never use it again. And that's just abuse of the intention of the trigger. So we can certainly toughen that up without any issues at all.
Thanks.
And just for the record, to Ben's point, that top left picture is certainly not representative of what goes on today. It may have been 10 years ago, but it's not representative today. That would never be allowed today to go like that. The entire industry has converted to a lot more environmentally friendly practices, where that sort of grinding out in the open air without any vacuum, without any controls is definitely not allowed anymore.
Yeah, I just don't want anybody environmentally to look at this brief
Well,
and be like, wait a minute, what are they doing there?
I agree, and that I don't know where these pictures come from. A lot of them are from my facility and others around, but I think it's a great point, and that particular one has bothered me since I've seen it a couple of months ago. So
but no worries, though. We're tightening it up. It's still draft, and you guys have done a fantastic job. I'm just trying to what if it and be a devil's advocate here and there. Okay.
And then I have another question. For the working boatyards, 20,000 square feet working yards, is there a real definition for what a working yard is?
Well, from my point of view, I think that the Planning and Zoning Office has a definition of what a working yard is, which supplies goods and services to the marine industry with trade groups and everything else there, providing a level of service. And again, I'm not sure, maybe Dr. Nash can comment on that, but I'm sure there's language that relates to the service and support of the marine industry.
And if there isn't, let's take an action to get that further talked about. What do you say, Sally? Dr. Nash, you around?
Yes, sorry, I was just trying to look in the code to see if there's
Okay, well then
what
while
the
you're
language
looking,
is.
while you're looking at that, we'll come back to it. That's an action item. All right.
And then the last question I had is a trigger about the on-land boat storage. Does that coincide with the parking, or is that a separate aspect of a yard? So a lot of times in the winter, you use the parking area to put boats up on storage for storage. So do you count the 25,000 square feet of on-land boat storage as like a dual function as parking as well?
No, the example I would give you, and Sally may be more current than I am on this, because obviously I'm going into ancient history, but it still exists. You have a functioning yard at Clarence Blackwell's Yacht Haven. That they do not have enough room there for all of their boat storage to maintain the yard. So the on-land boat storage for that yard is located on Templeton site, and that is used just for on-land boat storage. It's not Sally, I don't know of any circumstances where that is served as a trigger where it's both parking and on-land boat storage. It's on-land boat storage.
Right.
So then would that mean that Templeton site is providing the 20,000 square foot on-land boat storage for Yacht Haven?
No, Yacht Haven has their own triggers because they are a working yard. Templeton site is providing that for the Templeton site trigger.
Okay, gotcha. So there is a definition then of working yard. You just use the word functioning. So now I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. What's functioning yard versus a working yard? Sally, were you able to find that?
I'm sorry, Sally, what we can do is we can work on putting together a definition if the one in the code, because we never had the need for a definition because it's pretty apparent, but we can certainly develop one.
Yeah, I was going to say, Eileen, really in particular, because we've assumed a functioning yard at a place in Eastport, and there's absolutely no functioning yard at all. It's just boat slips, and there may be some office space for a yacht broker. So the whole concept of there being a real boatyard there has gone away, and it may be because we don't have a good definition of working yard, but Sally's looking at it and maybe she can find it.
Yep.
And if it's
you-
not, that could help.
Yep, and Diane, I'm with you on that one. And in the moment of efficiency, remember that. I'm gonna remember it, and we'll keep on proceeding. And before we get out of this, we're gonna come back to it. So I'm sure Sally's still defining and looking.
Yeah,
Unless
I
you have,
haven't seen anything. I think it's probably worth a recommendation that that be added.
Great, thank you. I think that will help. It will really clarify some things for
all right,
people in
well,
town.
that was pretty quick research, Sally, in the last 4 minutes that you, so if you find anything else, let us know, but we'll assume that's an action item that needs to be looked at from the group, as well as working with planning and zoning for a functioning site versus working yard versus what we're seeing right now and the issues it's caused. All right, can we proceed to the next slide? Got it. Next slide, please. We got that. Next slide. Fully, and we totally got that as well. But we'll hold on a second real quick here so everybody can look where we're at as far as where we're going to planning commission, city council, and then finally the working teams there. So I'd say we're about halfway through, if not more. I'd say about 3/4 of the way through. All right.
3/4, yeah.
All right, let's move on. So that's great to know. Again, the waterfront access greatly expand down there at the bottom. There's been word on the street for expropriation to add to Eastport water access availability. Has that been broached amongst this group, among concern of any of the participants in the group, or not even talked of yet?
I'm not sure I follow the question. Are you asking, are the property owners concerned about it?
Well, I would assume that they are, but has the expropriation of property to get expanded waterfront access been broached in this group as a risk acceptable, or has it been talked of amongst the whole group at all? I would assume not, because it's quite a touchy subject.
I would assume not. Let me ask Eric, because Eric and Wendy Waldman really has been the sort of the leader of the water access team, but let me ask Wendy and Eric. I don't think there's been any discussion of that. Has there, Eric?
I mean, I was kind of regretting not chiming in after Mike's slides, after I thought about it. I mean, this discussion that we're having within the task force is certainly within the context of a broader discussion about citywide water access that is a very large place within our comprehensive plan. So we're all cognizant of the need for more access, and in places where there are gaps in the city fabric, providing access. But the position has generally been, well, here we have an opportunity within the task force among essentially private property owners to help contribute to that, and through partnerships, and that there are opportunities at street ends that are currently underutilized adjacent to some of these properties where we could forge some type of a public-private investment. And so that's kind of the position we've been taking. But certainly acknowledging that there is a greater need for access. I mean, I wouldn't say it's that if I understand your question correctly at the beginning, that we have a diminishing amount of access. I mean, I think that's like a point of departure for this whole discussion. So that's maybe just.
Yeah, it's just really pretty simple, and it sounds like it wasn't broached. So I'll just go with that answer and move on. Does anybody else have any questions on this slide?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what are the incentives for water access activities? Like who's going to incentivize whom and how?
We've got another slide that goes over all of that. Why don't, when we have that slide up, why don't we use that?
How about we just move to the next slide, and when we get to that, we'll ask the question. So on to the next one, please.
Well, Ben, I will interrupt and say that I found a definition of working boatyard in our definition section, which was a clue there. But it means a working boatyard means an arrangement of piers, slips, mooring piles, wharves, and buoys not to exceed 30 slips intended to be used for the repair, construction, and temporary storage of watercraft which slips are not available for occupancy or rental by the general public.
Oh, that's important. It says nothing about active boatyard work taking place on site. No manufacturing or fabrication, no painting, none of the stuff that Birch Avens does. That's the kind of stuff we want to retain and do at Boatyard. So yeah, I agree. Maybe we can sit down and work on a definition that encompasses what we're trying to achieve, which is, retaining working boatyards.
If I could just say something really quickly,
Yeah.
What Dr. Nash just said there smacks of 1985, and it's not relevant today because that's not how the industry operates. And so I'd be happy to help craft new language that supports the definition, because it's just outdated. That's all it is. It was very relevant in the mid 80s,
Okay.
but not anymore.
Action item to the Maritime Task Force. That's excellent. Good job, Diane and Sally and Eileen and Rajaven, everyone. All right. The restaurants and the WMI support restaurants subject to standards, yada, yada. And I took Mr. Jabin's verbiage earlier as it's really important to allow these big property owners in these areas ability to make, I guess, have a more stable or a better financial income and multiple ways to get it. And I get the restaurants and WMI, however, the question I have is the 2,000, I think there's a 2,000 square foot limitation or was a percentage. Is that enough to make a restaurant that helps the yard, or does it need to be bigger? And I only say that because I've been in a lot of marinas around the country in my life, from Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, California, you name it. And I've seen big ones and I've seen really small ones that are less than 2,000. Do you think that's enough, or the percentage is hitting it, what you guys got?
The 2,000 square feet is what exists today in WME. And
Okay.
the answer is no. For WMI, we've talked with some of the owners. We actually talked with Leo Wilson, because he designs a lot of restaurants. And to give you an example, each floor of the yacht club is about 6,000 square feet. So where we wound up, because Rod and Scott and the other property owners were not looking at a large restaurant, Leo felt that sort of the minimum they should go with was about 4,000, that would be modest. So the size that has been discussed is about 4,000 square feet, because that's below average, but at least it's large enough to have a functioning restaurant.
Well, why not open it up to more? Like if you find out 4,000 is not going to work for you, at least 6,000 would be in it for future growth. Is that logical, or is that not something you want to do?
No.
That's logical.
I don't
And
know.
the only issue has been, we've been under, my whip, for want of a better word. We've tried to be conservative, so that 4,000 seemed conservative but large enough. But if you took a more average size, according to Leo Wilson, it would be closer to 5,000 to 6,000.
But not in WME, right, Eileen?
WME, we got it would have made sense to increase 2,000 to 4,000, but there was some support for it, but there was a lot of opposition. So WME, there's
Great.
not a recommendation to increase it above 2,000. And again, I think, as Ben pointed out, 2,000 is not very functioning.
But it's also in a yard that's really small. So if you try to have a functioning boatyard and a restaurant, it won't work. So I kind of agree with what you're saying. In the really small, or places like the boatyards in Eastport on Spa Creek, to try to put in a really big restaurant doesn't make sense. On Back Creek, where Jabin's is, of course, that makes sense, because you can have a functioning boatyard and a restaurant with no disasters. But I like the way the task force came out on this on WME. So I think that's a good recommendation.
And Mr. Jabin, what do you think about restaurants there? I know you had a brief earlier, but
Well, the
on your own property.
I'll just tell you how we got to 4,000, and that was basically the WMI. The two strongest property owners are the Jabin Yacht Yard and Port of Annapolis Marina and Annapolis Landing. And both Port Annapolis and myself kind of came out with the idea that, listen, the restaurant is going to be self-limiting. Our core business is boat storage and the service of boats on land. And I cannot afford to have a restaurant the size of the Chart House or even coming close to it, because that's going to compete for the available space that I'm trying to work on boats on. So we are looking for a restaurant that will enhance the operation of our facility, giving the boaters and the transient mariners a place to get breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but not really a standalone flagship
Not
restaurant.
something that's going to really draw a ton of people from Parole or Sagarna Park. You're talking about, I get it now. Totally get it.
And that's how we scaled back to 4,000. Although we did have, as Eileen said, we had Leo say, in order for it to be successful, it has to be 5 or 6 maybe, so you can get enough tables in there. But what we're coming from is right now in WMI, again, this goes back to 1980s, we're limited to 1,000 square feet, 10 seats or less in a deli operation. And so that's definitely not profitable. And you can't keep it open. So we want to expand it just a little bit so that you can get a sandwich and a beverage and enjoy the ambiance of the waterfront and everything else. But it has to be careful because we cannot have it compete with the core operations that we do here.
Is there any way that the new restaurant square footage or allowance could be abused, you think, or any way that we could cage it so it's not abused, where some other property might say, well, we'll just make it look like we have a marina, but we're going to put a huge restaurant here. So.
Well, I think the idea of this, after speaking to representatives of Port Annapolis and myself, the idea of 4,000 square feet, we both felt was enough square footage to develop our concept of the enhanced restaurant that we both serve. We both have the class 3 delis on our property where you can get a coffee and a donut, but we want to expand it so that you can actually cook a hamburger and fry some French fries and be able to have more than 10 seats in the restaurant. And that's all we're looking for. And so the idea of a cap on the square footage says it's not going to turn into a chart house operation because you don't have the square footage to do it without a special exception, I guess.
All right, I'm happy with that. Anybody else?
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Next. Okay, right here, if there was a little legend that tells me what the dots are, I kind of get it. It's probably the waterfront access, but green versus yellow. That's all I've got. And these circled areas for looking for, those are for additional development, right? Water access.
Yeah. The solid circles are the places that were sort of are existing projects that, they're finite, we know they're coming online. We have the answers for those. And then the others, we're still trying to figure out how to resolve, but are high priorities and
hence they're dashed. Got it. Okay. If you could just maybe define that in a little legend, it might be helpful, because sometimes these briefs get out without the briefer and they're just paper copies, and can get it modified. Any other question?
Yeah, I have a quick one. I noticed that SAYC is not on there, and the Planning Commission on January 5th, 2017 approved that project for water access. And they spent a lot of time on it. And even though I wasn't on the commission then, Mr. Sale was, and Bob Waldman, who isn't here, was, and David Iams was. And, I was just looking at the actual March 16th, 2017 letter that made it a condition of their approval at SAYC, which again was the old Sarles and Petrini's boatyards, that the owner shall make reasonable efforts to allow for pedestrian access to the property, to include water and water taxi access for pickup and drop off in the area designated by the owner. And then in the description in their application of what they were talking about in terms of water access, they included the promenade and an area to utilize, gather, green space. And so I'm curious, do you know why that is not circled like Wells Cove and Hawkins Cove when we actually have as,
Yeah, these are all public places, Diane. Eric put this together. Eric, I'm assuming that all you have on here are the public opportunities.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
so Tecumseh is public, because I always, try to let people in there to get on and off the water taxi, and it's really not public. So I'm just curious how that got on there.
No, I mean, the water taxi locations are all the yellow dots. So, I mean, that's pretty comprehensive. I think if I understood your question, Diane, is why is SAYC not identified in one of these blue circles? And that's, these are the prominent public locations. But I mean, I think we could certainly.
That was one of the conditions for approval. And so it should be a water access point, because that's what they said. That's what was, planning and zoning made sure. Tom Smith did a great job of writing up the conditions and said it would be public. So the fact that they, don't want it to be now, we should push on that a little bit. Here's the description of what they said to Mr. Waldman at 9:44 on January 5th, 2017. The open space will create a communal space, a place to gather, green space, a promenade along Spa Creek, which is designed to allow the public to walk along the creek, enjoying the maritime uses and views of historic downtown Annapolis. Sounds lovely. Moving pedestrians from the parking area to the waterfront, a walkway will guide them through the bioretention garden, which will feature deciduous trees, shrubs, grasses, and perennials along the boardwalk. Will allow areas to stop and enjoy plantings and wildlife, So it's really intended as this fabulous promenade that we've been talking about. So to not see it on there is a little weird.
Yeah, understood. I think I need to understand for myself a little bit more about where the project is headed at this point.
Okay.
Maybe address it in a different slide all by itself, probably, if that's the case. So you want it addressed, Diane? Is that what it is?
Yeah, if we could talk about it another time, maybe we can have a little meeting, just a subgroup to talk about. I don't know if Wendy and all the other people on your water access group have been talking about it or not, because they may not know about it. Because if you weren't on the planning commission and you didn't attend any of these meetings, you would not even know that that was a condition of approval of that working boatyard that hasn't become a working boatyard yet. So
yeah, it's news to me. That's helpful information. And if there are any other properties that have those kind of identified opportunities for public access or required opportunities, that would be also helpful to roll into the process.
Great. I would love to send you this information, because we have all the documentation, and lucky all the meetings were public and we have the, the conditions for the approval. So maybe that's one that we can add back onto the map.
Okay. If you could send them that information, it'd be greatly appreciated. And for the record, I was not here on the planning commission during the time when all this went through. I was in the Syria-Iraq war. So, all right. Any other questions for this slide?
So Ben, you missed the first one, but you were there for the second.
I was not, I don't believe I was. So I took a leave of absence for a short period after I came.
Oh, you're right. Here it is. George Matthews and Ben.
It's neither here nor there. Let's just keep going and get this going. It's getting late. All right, next slide, please. Finally, I love the slide showing us some, this is great for the water access and a little bit better signage. Let's be fair. There's a ton of fantastic signage at the end of streets and a lot of Annapolis.
Yeah.
This is just getting better. So I'm for it. Any other questions from anyone, comments? All right, next slide.
This is the slide when Diane asked earlier about what was envisioned in the hierarchy that, Mike Tomasini could certainly speak to if Diane had further questions.
So yeah, I was just curious, how would it work?
Do we still have Mike on? Because I can explain it as well. Okay, we may have lost.
He's coming forward now. He got kicked out, it looks, but he's here.
Okay. Mike, if you come on, just interrupt me, or Eric, why don't you describe it? You put these terrific slides together.
Sure. So I mean, the idea with the hierarchy, the triangle, is, we identified the big ticket items, the things that are clearly lacking in our city, that sort of prides itself on water access and exposure to the water. The community paddle facility, a community boating center, it's something that would be different than the crab facility. We're looking at opportunities in the WMM. That's kind of what we were had in mind, where there already are paddle launches, but nothing like that. Nothing like what we're showing here on the screen. This is not necessarily have to be a completely charitable venture. It should have programs that make paddle access more achievable for more people, but it could certainly be a revenue generating operation. And
Did you already have a target area for that exact location?
I mean, not really.
No.
I mean, there are
Okay.
places that make sense, but no, we haven't locked into any locations. But it doesn't.
All right.
not hard to-
As far as a good idea, briefing it, I get it. It's a good idea. But yeah, I guess you guys will get further down the road in development and target an area for that,
We
which would be
definitely
nice to
wanna
put on a
do
map.
And Ben, the idea that the Park Service has come up with, where we, with the Park Service's financial support, where we put together a very detailed water access strategy where we identify what goes where, how we're going to fund it, really an implementation plan, an action plan. We're going to kick off in November, or in the fall, I should say.
Okay, excellent. So that's where the detail comes. Wonderful.
Yep.
Any other
So
questions?
So no
Should I-
detail yet, how we would afford to buy these, there's no money that's going to be in the CIP budget for this stuff. It's just sort of philanthropic money you're hoping for.
Diane, can I
Wendy, on the
chime in
call,
real quick?
Mike? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. So I think the idea behind the incentives and a lot of the discussions has come from, if we're going to afford the property owners greater flexibility and the tenants that they can use in their spaces, then the benefit of that additional flexibility beyond what we're talking about for the triggers is a real community benefit, right? So we talked about that hierarchy, and it's on the previous slide. It's a commitment to provide 50 affordable parking spaces, either to restaurant employees or employees of maritime businesses in the districts, so that they're not on the street, right, in front of everybody's houses. And to put real dollars towards the improvement of existing street end parks, or towards establishing a more usable street end park. Like you and I know that the street end at 3rd Street is really just not a usable street end, outside of maybe catching a few white perch if you catch the tide right. So if one of the property owners wanted, say, an additional increase in their non-maritime tenancy, then they could commit some real dollars to it and get the thank you in the way of give us this and you can get that. And we wanted the incentives to be based on community improvements, not on oh well, I'm going to give you an extra 5% because you let Mike put a second pirate ship on your dock. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about creating real usable benefits to the community. And that's how these incentives came about. And I think that's the hope, is to figure out a way to implement them so that everybody gets what they want out of it.
And that's a great idea. I have to say, I like that a lot, because it would be terrific for the community. Now, who would do that negotiation? Because I love the concept, but who would be involved in actually, making sure that there was some way to deliver what was promised in terms of these community benefits?
Right. And as we know, the devil is in the details on these things, right? So if we can't figure it out, maybe the incentives are not all they're cracked up to be. But I think, the smart people have talked about it, long-term agreements like you do with a front foot sewer assessment, or those kinds of things, where a private property owner pays to upgrade the the infrastructure in front of their property in lieu of the city having to do that as part of an upgrade on their space. So I think there are tools. We've talked about it. Sally and I have talked about it, to try and figure out how we do it and how we make sure, number one, that it's not a one-time thing where you say, okay, well, I'll give you $100,000, you develop the street end park, and then it never gets developed and it doesn't get maintained, right? So those discussions have been happening. I think, we're still probably fairly far off on the concrete details, but I think we're headed in the right direction. I think I personally think it's a really good idea to deliver something for the community out of this task force, right? We've got some kind of, lingering issues that we can probably resolve as part of this study and this group putting their ideas forward. So I think that's where we're headed.
Okay.
Well, that's great, Mike. Thanks. So the real issue is just getting some concrete details around that. So maybe by the time we meet next, we can do that. So that's on the list of to do. So thank you so much for being our representative. I love you.
Right.
I appreciate it.
I believe the theme to this whole brief is this is still early in the development process and draft. So finite things come later. And we are all close to 9. We got a ton to cover tonight.
Sorry.
So we need to roll. So next slide 15, please. We already looked at that. Slide 16. Waterfront access, we talked about that. Promenade standards, great ideas. And that also plays a role into what Diane was talking about with the marina issue promised before. So if we could tie that in somehow. Next slide, please. Next. We talked about the triggers. Next. There's one thing I wanted to see here. I know it's very minor, but is city accommodation for a lot of boaters that I know that have come to town, and they're trying to be environmentally friendly with new sewage systems on their boat to handle its more biodegradable type toilets using it's like a self-mulching one, but the city doesn't provide that as a service to. So when these boats come into town, they're not actually allowed to stay at the mooring buoys. Rod, come on, help me here. What do you call the toilets on the boat that are basically self-mulching?
Composting.
Yes, thank you. So the city does not accommodate that. So somewhere in our brief, can we accommodate those a city effort to, instead of just having sewage pump out boats, we actually have a boat or a place that we can service them? Because up and down the bay, I have friends that have come to town and they're like, dude, I can't even stay in Annapolis on the mooring buoy. They tell me I got to leave because I have a composting toilet. But if I go to the Eastern Shore or some other town, they've got facilities, where I can take care of this. So.
Yeah, let me ask Susan Zellers. Oh, I'm sorry, Rod. I was going to ask Susan as well. Let me turn it over to you guys.
I'm clueless when it comes to composting toilets. I can't answer, Rod. I'll leave it to you, Rod.
Facility to put your items in, go ahead, Rod.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately, I'm with Susan. There's such a small percentage of boats that use a composting toilet that nobody reacts to it. And in as much as Annapolis and stuff is working on getting approved to be a no discharge zone, all that won't make any difference anyway. And if composting gets any more popular, there certainly will be facilities that will service those. But I gotta tell you that out of 1,000 boats that we push through here a month, I don't ever get a question of how do I service my composting toilet. So it's just not prevalent here to that extent. I'm happy I don't think it can hurt to put a bullet point in there about that, but the reality is we just don't see very many of them.
All right, well, the example comes from the people who help out with the boat show, the cruisers, and they come in town, and most of these people have actually composting toilets, but they don't come here anymore because they were told to leave. So maybe that's why you don't see them. But I agree with you. It's not as prevalent because it's new, but they're selling them also at the boat show. So it's just an item, very small. Anybody else have any questions for what's here? All right, next slide. The funding sources.
I just had a question about the TIF financing. Is that something that requires enabling legislation from the state? or could you do it? Could you do it now?
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
The existing TIF statutes are all aimed at some sort of development, putting in infrastructure. The concept here is to do this more on a city policy basis and make it city policy that they will dedicate a increment to this fund that would promote the maritime industry.
So the answer is no, it doesn't require any additional legislation.
Right. I think it can be done by just as a matter of city policy that we're going to take a certain portion of our property tax from the maritime industry and target it for this fund.
Okay, so it's really TIF-like is probably a better.
Yeah, the concept is TIF-like. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And John, the funding sources in regards to real property taxes or from the assessment growth, can you give me just a quick example of if I'm a property owner and I pay $100 in property taxes, where would that money be going before January 22nd versus after January 22nd? How much of it?
You'd be blind to what's going on. Your tax bill wouldn't go up. Your tax bill would be exactly the same. It would just be that the city now through its budgetary process would siphon off that increment and direct it over to this fund.
It almost seems like you, to be fair to those people paying the taxes, that they should siphon off even more. Because why would most of my $100 be going to pave roads somewhere else? You know, I mean, obviously people got to get to Marina, but yeah, is that enough or does it need to be more?
Well, we haven't gotten down into the nitty gritty about the size this fund needs to be, but I think this TIF kind of a concept could be a significant proportion of what this fund could generate.
Okay, so in the draft phase. Got it. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Next slide. I think we're coming to the close. Next slide. Yeah, that's pretty much what we talked about before. Next slide. And next slide. I know that I don't have any further questions. Does anybody else have any questions from any part of the brief? Because we're pretty much at the end. Okay, fantastic. And we do realize this is somewhat of a draft, so everything gets further developed as you guys continue to meet and go down the road. And I appreciate it. It's been fantastic briefing and did it all in just under an hour. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I do have one follow-up, just terms of your next steps. You know, once you sort of get this plan worked out and address a lot of these concerns that have been mentioned, would you typically, are you thinking about having, some legislation introduced that brings a package of changes together, that deal with all of these things with respect to uses and in the maritime zoning, or would you try to do these things in pieces? I'm just sort of curious what your
We are, and I say we, so remember all these people you see are all volunteer in addition to the incredible planning staff who are working triple time. So we, the larger we absolutely need to bring it together as a package, because once you start separating the pieces, you separate really what is the consensus. And part of why the industry supports it is because of the fund. Part of why the residents support it are because of the water access incentives. So we've got to bring it together as a package.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. Is it really? It might not make as much sense if it's all disintermediated. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's been great to hear this discussion.
Ben, you're muted.
Yeah, nice job. You guys put a lot of work
Yes.
into that.
Thank you, everyone. That was great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Eileen. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for that note that I was still muted. That was very nice. We're moving on from new business to the public hearings. 0121 bulk regulations, the R4 and R4R residential zoning districts for the purpose of correcting conflicts. Public hearings continued from April 1st, 2021. And I'll go ahead and display the 0121 from the planning staff. And planning staff, go ahead. Is there any additional comments or items to add for that item?
Good evening. We received no additional public comments for this ordinance.
Okay. All right, going back to that. So from the planning commissioners themselves, are there any other questions with regard to the regulations table and the table notes that we had attached to the single family multifamily dwelling units? It was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think we had to close the public hearing and in light of no additional comments and bring it to a close.
All right, so the public hearing is closed. There's no other comments that the commissioners have received or we have received from staff on 01-21. For the commissioners' last minute comments on the item, I have nothing further to add. It's pretty cut and straight.
Yeah, I'll make a motion that we support this.
Okay.
I'll second the motion.
Got a motion, second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll take the vote. All those in favor of the bulk regulation change?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Any abstentions? The motion passes unanimously 4-0. Thank you very much, Dr. Nash. 0121, we support.
Thank you. Does anyone want to work on the findings or do you want me to format them and send them to you?
I believe this one's a simple, straight shot, especially since it's from really a planning and zoning staff oriented one. So if you could do that and send it to us, we'll all see it as a whole if we have any comments, but I doubt we'll have any changes.
Perfect.
All right, thank you. Moving on to ordinance O-7-21, the short-term rental licenses for the purpose of requiring special exception approval for a new non-owner occupied short-term rental license in the R2NC, C1 and C1A conservation residence districts, requiring special exception approval for the transfer of any existing non-owner occupied short-term rental licenses in the R2NC, C1 or C1A conservation residence districts, providing definitions, providing for the waiver of special exception approval for certain individuals, and generally related to short-term rental licenses. This is a new item. We're hearing it for the first time, and the public hearing on this item will be held open until May 6th meeting, our next planning commission meeting. And the reason I read these whole out is because in case somebody can't see this, they can actually hear what's just said. So moving on for the staff presentation for ordinance O-7-21, please go ahead.
Good evening. This ordinance O-721, also known as ZTA 2021-005, if you're looking for the documents in eTracket, proposes to make new non-owner occupied short-term rental licenses a special exception in 3 of our zoning districts, R2NC, which is mostly or all in Ward 8, C1 and C1A, which are in Wards 1. This includes transfers of existing licenses to a new owner, but as written now grandfathers existing users. The table on your staff report was prepared in order to try and get a handle on this rather slippery data. I looked at February 2020 and February 2021 in some software that's called Host Compliance. It's a company the city's recently hired to help us enforce as well as execute our short-term rental program. So people can apply through this platform and pay through this platform. We then get notice and do an inspection. And it searches over 60 websites where people advertise short-term rentals and make sure that people are properly licensed and paying the correct amount of taxes. I wanted to find out when you look at each zoning district and you look at the total number of parcels in each zoning district, what's the percentage of short-term rentals in each of those zoning districts. And so you can see that there's some districts that have higher percentages, and these include the 3 that are currently being proposed for this use to be a short-term rental. These numbers are, I should caveat a little bit the table for a few reasons. One, this is just capturing people who are actively advertising their homes for short-term rental. You can see the totals there is different than the totals we have in our tracked system of the number of people who have licenses. That's about 230 people. So at any given time, any of these 230 people could be advertising their short-term rentals, but we know from the host compliance how many of them are actually actively doing so. There was an ordinance about a year ago, 2619, that restricted short-term rentals throughout the city. It was signed into law February 14th, 2020. So we were trying to find out if we could see any effects of this ordinance, which limits the number of short-term rentals someone can have to 1. But it was not great timing because the short-term rental industry also took a big hit with COVID, as you can imagine. So it was impossible to really tell apart the difference between the effects of the 2619 and global pandemic. So, I sort of had to do the best I could with the data I had and the tracking mechanisms that are available to us. But so this legislation, it proposes a new use in Title 21. And you may remember that short-term rentals, long-term rentals, it isn't mentioned in Title 21. It's not regulated in planning and zoning until this ordinance. It is regulated in Title 17, which is more of where our building code is, inspections, property maintenance code, things like that. So this legislation doesn't say you can't have a short-term rental in C1, C1A, and R2 and C. And I want to make that clear because we've gotten some public comments along those lines. What it does is require that you have to apply for a special exception. And as you know, a special exception is a use where, based on the exact location of the use, you want to have a little bit more scrutiny about where the use is proposed, what are the exact conditions of the area, and is it appropriate for that exact location? So it's a kind of safeguarding of when you want to have a little bit of extra scrutiny on a use. Special exceptions have to go to the Board of Appeals for approval. There's specific criteria that the Board of Appeals looks at when they're reviewing special exceptions. And I've listed these in my staff report, but they include things such as the applicant has to show that the special exception use that's being proposed won't be detrimental or endanger public health, safety, or morals, that the special exception won't hurt the use and enjoyment of other properties in the immediate vicinity, that the establishment of the special exception will not impede normal and orderly development, that there's adequate utilities, access roads, drainage that are provided, that there's ingress and egress to the site, and that the special exception in all other respects conforms to applicable regulations of that district. So these are, you can imagine it might be difficult in certain situations to meet these standards, but it is possible to do so. And, you have to come in and make your case. One thing I did want to point out was that from a regulatory standpoint, special exceptions run with the land. So I need to talk to the law office and make sure that this makes sense for this ordinance, how we would tie a special exception to a license and not to a property. I have to make a note to do that with the law office. I'm not sure if that would require an amendment of some sort. So before this ordinance, we always considered a short-term rental, just like long-term rental, to be the same use as a single-family dwelling, either single-family attached, single-family attached, whatever it was, that was the use, because that's where people were eating, sleeping, and cooking. And so this creates kind of a new shift in Title 21, where suddenly short-term rentals will be a new use, will be a new row in our use table. And that actually reminds me of another amendment I would need to discuss with the sponsors, is that this only allows short-term rentals permitted or by right or by special exception in residential districts. There are some other districts where there's residential uses we might want to allow short-term rentals in these locations as well. So we might need to add those to the table of uses. And I just noticed that when I was writing my staff report. So there's two things to look into. In my staff report, I also go into some detail about these zoning districts and the purposes as established in Title 21 for these zoning districts. They are all conservation districts. And like all of our conservation districts, designed to conserve some specific aspect. So for example, in C1, conservation of educational, cultural, and historical character of the old city. C1A is the focus of intensive public effort, including periodic monitoring of land use to minimize conversions from single families to multifamilies or office use to stabilize and enhance the residential quality of life. And R2 in C, to preserve patterns of design and development in residential neighborhoods characterized by a diversity of styles. All right. Oh, thank you. Ben is showing the map of these three zoning districts. So you can see there, it is downtown and Eastport. I also include some information from Title 17, including some of the things we regulate in short-term rentals. The new requirement, as I mentioned, that there can only be one, a licensee may not hold more than one short-term rental operating license. The licensee must reside in the city or employ a local property manager. These are all from the recent ordinance that passed a year ago. Other things, the short-term rental operating license has to be registered with the state controller because we collect taxes on these properties. And that if your homeowners association or condominium association doesn't allow short-term rentals, we will not give you a short-term rental license. Although sometimes we still find situations where people are advertising short-term rentals where they're not allowed by the homeowners association. So those are some of the the changes that occurred with the new regulation. Finally, the last part of this ordinance is to create a new definition of non-owner occupied dwelling unit used for short-term rental. And it is defined as a premises that is not designated as the owner's principal residence with the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. This database is found online, and host compliance also asks for this information when they're registering people. That concludes my report. Are there any questions for me? There's a lot of public testimony and 2 people to testify live.
I have one question for you, Dr. Nash. So this only deals with non-owner. So the use is only non-owner.
That's right.
But the title 17 takes care of owner occupied, or in other single family districts and stuff.
Title 17 regulates owner and non-owner occupied short-term rentals the same way.
I guess what I'm getting at is that it just seems incongruous to not have an owner occupied use. Additionally, it just seems odd to have that non-owner occupied as a use, but not owner occupied as a use also. Separate with different standards, perhaps in different zones, but it just seems odd.
Its own line in the bulk, in the use table.
Yeah. So I don't know if that seems incongruous to you, or.
I also wonder if we should have long-term renter, and I don't want to make our use table any more complicated, but I agree that it doesn't make perfect sense. So then would you have, I mean, long-term, you're probably not going to have an owner occupied long-term. So then would you just have, I don't, trying to figure out a way to make it not more complicated, but to do what the sponsors intended to do.
Okay, I mean, we don't have to solve that here.
I'll think
something
about
I
that.
wanted to raise.
Mhm.
Also, in looking at the special exception criteria, that you had in your staff report, and in the absence of any specific standards that go along with the use table, the changes in use table, when I look at those criteria, I find it hard to see how a short-term rental doesn't. I find it hard that it doesn't easily satisfy all those criteria, and that it might end up being sort of rather arbitrary as to whether the Board of Appeals would have enough meat to evaluate any particular application. What's your sense about that? Because the general criteria are pretty generic. I mean, morals and convenience, general welfare, adequate roads. You assume sort of all these things kind of fit for the fact that it's a residence, and I would think additional standards might give the Board of Appeals something to chew on. But I'm just curious, what your thoughts on that are, having more experience with the Board of Appeals. But it just doesn't seem like there's enough to evaluate any application without being rather arbitrary.
I could see them struggling. It's hard to know how people will respond to the standards and demonstrate how they do address them. Sometimes things, I think it's going to be hard for them to show how they meet the standards they're able to very well, and vice versa. So it probably is a situation where additional standards would be helpful to
I think the,
clarify what exactly the impacts of this use are, and how they would be worse in certain places.
Yeah, and maybe this is when we get to the point where the sponsor, Alderman Tierney Alderwoman Tierney will talk about this. I have some questions about that with respect to standards, so I'll probably hold that till that point. And the other thing was, when in your description of the zones that the special exception would apply, especially the R2NC, the description of that zone is more about design and form, has really nothing to do with something like a short-term rental, based on what the description is. So that again leads you to believe that something might be kind of arbitrary, and a little less so with the other two zones. I think one you mentioned that has something about maintaining vibrancy, whatever, something about the community, and that's kind of where I was gonna go with that with Alderwoman Tierney. But I mean, do you think that ends up being gonna make an application hard to sort of say, well, it doesn't fit here, and under what circumstances?
I could see that. Yes, I could see that making it difficult.
Okay.
So that probably again speaks to thinking of some additional standards, probably.
Okay, that I'll hold my last thing for when Alderwoman Tierney wants to talk about that.
So on mine, whenever I see anything with rentals at all, I see that, I know the city has a really hard time with, and maybe it's gotten better, with compliance issues. And, I live in a condominium community where they don't allow short-term rentals. However, people do it all the time. And they get away with it because they say, oh, it's a roommate, even though they live in DC. They don't even live anywhere near the area. And the question is what can we do to enforce it? First of all, is the Board of Appeals going to know what the condo documents say, for example? If they do catch them, do they really take any action? Because we found that they never really take any action. That people make up excuses, and the next thing people get away with these things. And what can we do to make sure that any rentals have licenses? Because when we looked at Oxford Landing, we really showed that a large percentage of the people in Oxford Landing did not have rental licenses. People were just skirting the issue and saving on taxes. So I'm just wondering, is there any way, if we're going to bring more rentals in, is there anything we can do to even enforce we're not even enforcing the rentals we have as it is?
Well, that's one reason we hired host compliance, because we don't have the resources to monitor 60 different websites looking for people advertising short-term rentals and then figuring out which of them are legal or not. But with host compliance, we get a map with green dots and red dots, and so it's it's a lot easier. So we can amp up our enforcement efforts, and we do that. We send notices of violation. Hey, we notice you've been advertising this. Our goal isn't to punish people. Our goal is to bring people into compliance. And sometimes that takes people a little while. And, we try to be patient, because I feel like that in the end leads to more successful compliance. But then ultimately we have to issue fines. They don't pay the fines, as to go to court. It does take a long time. I know it is frustrating.
Well, I think it's frustrating, especially where we are, where host compliance is that take into account somebody who lives in DC, but has a place in Maryland if it's outside the city, if it's outside the state. And that's where we're finding a lot of issues in Annapolis, because we're kind of a suburb to a degree of DC. So, we're not, it's is it just looking within Maryland, for example, for the owners? If they have a primary residence in Maryland. And I know, for example, I've got one unit in my community that they've been renting it as a short-term unit for 20 years. And just the person who lives, whenever they rent it to somebody, the person they're renting it to has to say, this is my roommate, even though they've never lived there.
Oh, well, enforcement's going to be, we're not going to get 100% on our enforcement.
Okay.
And a lot of times it's hard to prove it, unless we have an ad from Airbnb, sometimes you can't prove that what a relationship between two people is. And we're not going to have our inspectors stake out your condominiums, like looking who's coming and going and then doing a blood test to see if they're related. Like there's just some things we're not going to be able to enforce.
I think what we found at Oxford Landing was, when Miss Pindell Charles went around and did that, she did basically a survey of people about, she wanted to get people to sign a petition, and just matching that up with the county records saying who's owner occupied and who's not, and found out that a lot of the people that said they were living there were not the owners, even though they were listed as owner occupied units. That's where we realized that, hey, just matching up the tax records takes care of a lot of the issues right there.
Right. We look at the tax records that are not, it's the same thing. There's accuracy issues there, but how it is the most accessible, easiest way we have to verify or not owner occupancy.
Okay.
So it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah, it kind of makes me feel like I don't want to do anything more to bring more rentals in, because I think our numbers are all off as far as how many rentals we actually have in the city. I think a lot of people are not in compliance, and that's why I get concerned from what I've seen. But thank you.
Any other questions for me?
Diane, or?
Well, yeah, I want to thank you, Dr. Nash. I thought your staff report was really comprehensive and really useful, and I'm really glad you mentioned that there are some questions for the Office of Law. I agree with your questions about how there might be an issue with how this special exception runs with the land, but then the wording of this ordinance makes it sound like it doesn't, and that creates a bit of a conflict. It's also something that Bob Waldman raised in his comments. I also need to say that this may be a conflict of interest for me because I own a short-term rental in the city. So I want to be able to recuse myself right now from a vote, but be able to participate in any conversation, because I might be able to tell you how easy it was to actually get our short-term license from the city. Your inspectors were efficient. Mary Emmer came out, and it was easy to get our our tax information from the state. So while I want to recuse myself from the actual vote, I'm here to answer questions because I do have some experience with this.
Thank you, Diane. And I personally would like to keep you into the debate and to talk about it, but just to make sure we do parliamentary procedure correct, if someone recuses themselves, do they still maintain the bully pulpit influence? I say go right ahead. Anybody else have an issue with that? Okay, we're all in a violent agreement. Thank you, Diane, to keep participating. Sally, I live in an R2 area, but it's not NC. For those residents in R1, R2, R3 that are not listed up here, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Title 17, there can already be short-term rentals in their neighborhoods, right?
Right. Right now, there can be short-term rentals in any district of the city that allows residential uses.
Okay, so right now, as it stands, short-term rentals, everywhere, and they have to apply for a permit, right?
That's right. You have to apply for a short-term rental permit. You have to have an inspection of your entire property, even if you're just renting out one room, and it has to meet certain code criteria, and that's renewed every year.
And the reason I'm walking through this is for the general public out there, layman here. So already passed by the city council, and it's in law. Anywhere there's residential uses, you can have short-term rental already.
That's not true.
Is that not true?
Not if the community itself does not allow them.
Good point to add, Mr. Ives. Thank you very much. And as far as applications, and one would have thought, oh my God, there would have been tens of 2,000 permits requested. Did that happen, Sally?
Sorry, say that again?
What did you get a ton of applications after that? I would doubt it because of COVID, right? But
right, COVID.
And those Title 17, that Title 17 ability, and that's still one per owner, right? And
right. So even before that ordinance, you could have short-term rentals.
Okay, great. But it's only one per owner, right?
It is only one.
Now it is. So if you own multiple properties in the city of Annapolis, only one of those can be a short-term rental.
That's
whether
right.
it's under Title 17 or with this Title 21 modification, correct?
That doesn't, yes, this does not affect that provision.
Thank you. So what we're really doing here with this little piece of legislation is making it more restrictive in the C1, C1A, and R2NC. So this is the first step at, I guess, the city council and anybody making legislation to refine what's been done in the past and kind of start limiting it in areas. So this is a little step in limiting and giving the residents around these short-term rentals some kind of say-so. So C1, C1A, R2NC, it would be a special exception required to go to the Board of Appeals if you were going to have a short-term rental. You can still only have one if you're an owner. It's non-occupied, but you go to the Board of Appeals. Are we, in your mind, going to be saddling the Board of Appeals with more than they could handle? Because that, I mean, each one of these could take quite a bit of a time. And is there any other thing you would recommend that we do to give the public around that application a chance to comment other than going to Board of Appeals? Or is that what we're supposed to do? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I would say my staff is pretty nervous about that. I would say as long as existing short-term rental license holders do not have to go through the special exception process, I think we'll be able to manage new non-owner occupied getting special exceptions. I mean, it might take them a while before they can get in front of the Board of Appeals. It might have to be metered like that, but I think it will be manageable. I think if we did not have grandfathering for existing users, that would be ugly.
And grandfathering is in here.
It is currently in this legislation.
Okay. So any new or a transfer, there were some mentions in the comments we got about a transfer an existing license, yada, yada, yada. So, okay, we've gotten that. So already short-term rentals are out there. They're allowed, but just not in Title 21. But though also what this does is make all of the other residential areas, R1, R2, R3, the ones that are not listed here, all of those are also included in this legislation to be allowed short-term rentals in Title 21. Why is that part in there? That's the first in the first sentence up here. Why is that? And why don't we just leave it in Title 17?
Well, so when we added this use to the table of uses in 21, we had to make clear that is either special exception or it's permitted or it's not permitted. We have to fill out the square in the table. Once it has its own row, something has to go in the square. So they're permitted now and they would be permitted after this ordinance in the other zoning districts.
Okay, and that's right here where you see me saying it's this part right here, and be permitted in all residential zoning districts by right, except for these three that we'll handle specifically. So,
right.
But do you have to do so you have to do this part in order to do the rest in any 21, right? Is that what you're telling me?
Right.
you have to allow it in all residential zoning districts by right.
Oh, well, no, I mean, you could make it special exception in every zoning district. You could make it not permitted in some zoning districts.
But would
You
that
know,
conflict with Title 17?
You would, Title 17, you might need to defer to titles. You might need to also amend Title 17, or there might be language in Title 17 about the type of dwelling unit and whether it's permitted in zoning. I'm not sure. I know that this ordinance does amend 17 to make sure it refers to 21 for some uses that might need a special exception. But we'd have to check that with the Office of Law.
And the reason why I'm saying this is since I live in R2, friends in R2, 3, 1, all of that, we're saying we're going to allow short-term rentals by right in all residential zoning districts with this legislation. And then we're
No, that's how it is now.
That's how it is now. But the way this reads is if we're going to allow it in under 21. But if you just remove this, it already is allowed in by 17.
It is already allowed. Mhm.
So really, we're not allowing it here and be permitted in all residential zoning districts by right. It already is permitted in all zoning districts by right.
Right.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's clear, because it almost makes it look like we're approving it for every district.
I see what you mean. Mhm.
Okay, so, now I get the gist of what you're saying. Okay. The enforcement, well, David Iams, I get it. Yeah, enforcing anything in the city is almost a moot point. Enforcing speed limits doesn't happen. It's just it's a massive problem. But what we have to do is set up some kind of restrictions somehow in the code, and this is what we have to do. Whether or not it gets enforced well or not, that's a whole nother argument. But I'm with you. I don't have anything else for questions at the moment for you, Sally, so I'll turn it over to anybody else who has questions.
I have one quick one, just on that last point, Ben. So Dr. Nash, would it be host compliance that would get the information about which communities in our city allow short-term rentals? Or is it the city that has to do that work? Because that is kind of hard to get to. There's probably 50 different, maybe 50 condo communities, and some allow short-term rentals and some specifically disallow them. So who would be keeping track of that?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think the city would keep track of it. I think that would be something where if we got a complaint from a homeowners association, we would go look up whether they had a license, whether it was compliant as far as we were concerned or not. And if they had gotten a license from us and then we get a letter from the homeowners association, we will have to revoke that approval. But we might not know, just looking at an application if it's allowed or not.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Does Title 17 overrule Title 20 if we took out if we didn't allow it for every other residential area?
So
it'd almost be undoing what was done. You know what I mean?
Right.
Sally, you may want to make sure that the application for any short-term rental has them certifying that their community allows short-term rentals, and making sure that's clearly in there.
That's a good idea.
That's a good idea. Mm-hmm.
Honest with you, I'd like to see my own neighborhood zone added to it, but then that could totally overload you, or come with a different piece of legislation. So you add, I mean, that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see my own neighbor added for special exception, instead of having my neighbors turn everything into short-term rentals, which is slowly happening. Okay, but that's not in this legislation yet. All right. Any other commissioners have any questions for Sally and the staff at the moment? Okay, we'll move on to the public, and we'll open up the public hearing. And the public hearing will first start off with the sponsors of this legislation, and we go down to show that down here. Here we go, Alderwoman Tierney, and no co-sponsors, so solely the hard work of herself and other people that she's working with. So there you go, Ms. Tierney, please display what you want, and I can stop sharing what I have, and any way I can help you out, whatever you'd like.
Sure.
If
Okay.
I can help in any way, tell me to go up, down, or.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for your service, Ben. I did not know that that you served overseas.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay. Sally explained the staff report, and I guess what I want to do is talk about the background of this. This is really where our system works in a way. You know, planning works from the Ward 1 sector study back 20 years ago. You mentioned the maritime study was 37 years ago, so this is sort of young. The Ward 1 sector study at the time identified in Ward 1. Well, let me preface this by saying I'm going to speak more of the C1 and C1A when I give you this background. But at the time, 20 years ago, it was in the Ward 1 sector study, it was like, boy, these are tough neighborhoods in the sense that they're right next to the business district, if you will. They're subject to a lot of traffic noise and all that. And there's a limited amount of inventory, of housing inventory. So we're going to call these, conservation districts and have criteria for same. And at the time, it was ironic because inns and bed and breakfasts were considered, these new businesses coming in. So they were, they required a special exception process. I say it worked because it went from the Ward 1 sector study to the comprehensive plan, and then it was codified in the code. These districts were codified as conservation districts, which is, and that's always been sort of a struggle to define, but I find that the whereas clauses in this ordinance are very good, saying that, for example, if you want to show the whereas clauses, the second one, if you scroll down just a little bit, Ben, right there, section, right there, stop, 21 of the Annapolis City Code states that the R2NC single family residence neighborhood conservation districts preserve patterns of design and development in residential neighborhoods characterized by a diversity of style. So as Alex said, that conservation district was more about scale and fabric. But then if you go on down to the C1A, the C1A Special Conservation District is designed to preserve neighborhoods that have been identified as at risk in the Annapolis Comprehensive Plan, as amended through and including amendments to the Ward 1 sector study. At-risk neighborhoods are identified as being significantly impacted by at least two of the following characteristics. And this is going to answer your question about why the special exception process is really tailored for this. They're impacted by at least two of the following characteristics: a growing number of non-conforming uses, unmaintained buildings or lots, traffic volumes inconsistent with strictly residential land uses due to commercial traffic and other adverse impacts. To minimize, okay. And then also the pressures that it continues to say. And I guess I don't want to bore you with reading the whole legislation out loud, but the whereas clauses are really frame the problem here. And it's not so much, how many where they go, all that. It's what is a non-conforming use, and the big pivot here, if you will, was we've identified these non-owner occupied. Well, actually, I do have to have you scroll down. If you go down another page, whereas next page, my page doesn't line up with yours. I know, go back up, it's 21. It defines the definition finally. Well, I guess I'll read it from where is it? Whereas not, where's the part that says, whereas non-owner occupied short-term rental properties are income producing properties that are used as commercial businesses and as such should not be permitted in the R2, NC, C1, and C1A conservation districts. So that's what's important here. We struggled with this because I know that I looked at other areas and say, how do we differentiate between the owner occupied and the non-owner occupied? And this is the best way that we could do it. Why separated? Because these are typically run as an investment property, if you will. It's not a residential dwelling like a regular Airbnb where the owner's there, at least owns the property, is there, not necessarily there when they're renting out, but there when it's their primary residence. So they are in the neighborhood, they walk their dog when they're home, and they're engrossed in the neighborhood. These dwellings that are used for the short-term rentals are not occupied as a residence when not in use as a rental. So they're empty, and that was very obvious during the pandemic, because unfortunately they didn't have business, so they were not at use. But let me get back to the map. If you showed the map, I don't know if it's really clear. The other thing with the theme of at-risk neighborhoods is this is, if you showed these zones compared to the city of Annapolis, we're talking about, and this has to be very clear, even to my colleagues, that these three zones are just a portion of the city of Annapolis. And why are we targeting these three zones? Not only because of the labeling of them being conservation districts and at-risk residential areas, but they are in high demand because of their vicinity, specifically with C1 and C1A to the Naval Academy. So we do have a plethora of Airbnbs, owner occupied, and we continue to have them. That's why we have a consultant to collect their taxes, and we're totally aware of that. But we have a limited, and if you can see from this map, there's a limited inventory of dwellings, and historic dwellings at that. They can't be demoed or rebuilt to be anything else. They're fixed inventory of housing. So you have to protect it. And this is why this vehicle of a special exception is even more important. The streets are tight. The walls are shared. They're demising walls between townhomes, et cetera. And but the main thing is the fixed inventory of housing, because whenever one of these houses is bought to be used as a rental, short-term rental, it's a lost opportunity for a primary resident and a long-term renter, somebody that can contribute in that sense. And we've heard the testimony. It's a really tough. It's an awful it's an awful debate, because the testimony the people that have these rentals will say, I'm a good neighbor. I put a wreath on my door when it's Christmas, when I'm, it's hard to get into that level of detail. I mean, a resident versus a non-resident, but the fact of the matter is that it does preclude somebody from buying a home and setting up camp there and having children and becoming a fabric of the community. I'm not arguing the point that a short-term rental doesn't contribute in some way, financially, yes. So that is to answer, I think, Alex's question again. Last year, we had a huge effort of my colleagues. I was recused because I had a bed and breakfast at the time. But I was recused. But I know that it took a long time to pass, and we can't have citywide bed and breakfast legislation. It's but this was a humongous attempt to do that, and So what I did is, as an engineer, I realized, obviously, from the testimony a year ago, most of them coming from these districts, was that we still had a problem. And I have moved out of the historic district. Well, I am in the historic district. I'm in. I'm not accused anymore. So I wanted to distill this down to what the problem is. And I did not want to open up the legislation again, which was a fear of my colleagues, because it was an ordeal. So I really tried to focus with it just being Title 21. Because what this simply does is address that problem that was clearly not addressed a year ago, based on the testimony then and in now. And the testimony works both ways. When I introduced this legislation, it wasn't understood by the Airbnb community, but you can see the urgency in the testimony of people that do this. This is a really high. It's very high profile real estate. They can walk to stadium events, they can walk to boat shows. And so, this, I think, is a fair compromise. God forbid if we did like other cities and banned them. This is a fair compromise, because if I played back all the testimony from last year and I printed it out, and you could see that the testimony was traffic, noise, and that. So the special exception process is a good compromise, because it puts the responsibility on the buyer to come in and say, this is what I'm going to do. It's also a vehicle to have the public, they are well notified, these special exceptions, and the public can testify. Yeah, they're going to go and say, we don't want another one, but they have to speak the specifics of the Title 21 special exception criteria. I thought about adding more conditions, because if you look at other non-conforming uses, there are more conditions, but I'm a realist. I know what we can enforce and what we can't enforce. And, I don't even think it's legal to say, I don't know. I've been told different things about having so many on a block, and because I think they have that for bed and breakfasts, but I don't know. I didn't want this to be about regulating and the optics to be about regulating. I wanted it to be a solution to a problem. Regarding the data, it is in flux. I know I didn't yell at Sally, but I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't show that there's really a problem. The problem is that the data was collected during the pandemic. The hosts were shut. The platforms were basically shut down. They not shut down, but they had really strict rules. So a lot of the people didn't even use the platforms because of all the pandemic criteria. So, and then also our host compliance company is just starting up, and I'm not sure they're really fully engaged yet. And the other thing is, and this is where this comes in handy, is they, owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. I don't know how they register with the platforms. You can't tell by a platform what they are. So this legislation does add that it is subject to that review by the Director of Planning and Zoning and the Finance Department, because we will look at the SSTAT and see if it's their primary residence or not. What other points did I want to make? I think I touched upon what I wanted to. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling all over the place, but I think that you just have to, like Ben was saying, this unfortunately I had to open up 17 just to make the connection between 17 and 21, but this just distills down to a problem. And the rationale is there for these conservation districts. The public it's tough. I mean, this is a tough market, and there's, when you're talking about people's businesses, it's very tough. So I tried to make it as much of a compromise as possible. And you know, and good luck if you want to add any more zones.
So can I ask my question now?
Yeah, I can stop talking.
I mean to preempt you, sort of,
No,
but not
good.
really.
No, you have to. I'm getting tired.
So the question I had, you know, is around, you know, how the Board of Appeals would decide something like this. So say you had somebody who had a place on Pinckney Street versus, you know, King George Street versus East Street. You know, how would the Board of Appeals decide, well, it's okay here, but not there?
Oh,
So that's,
yeah.
you know, that
I can answer
without
that.
being rather arbitrary. I mean,
Yeah.
like, just to say, I think I have a pretty good handle on what the problem is, and I certainly sympathize with, you know, what's happening in those areas with respect to the community, and I understand where you're going with respect to, you know, having, you know, wanting to have people living there that participate in the community and make it a you know, a lively community. But I don't see anything in here that gets at that, or something that the Board of Appeals could objectively measure. This is contributing to community, this is not. I mean, you could say that, well, none of them do, and that's a valid thing to say. But how do you judge whether the one on Pinckney Street does or doesn't versus the one on East Street? That without any standards to make you, you know, I'd like you to try to explain to me.
Sure.
how
Yeah,
that could work.
we don't have the special exception criteria handy, do we?
Yeah, it's in it's in the staff report.
Yeah, so for example, your example for Pinckney, I mean, I'm not on the Board of Appeals, so I don't, you know what specifically, but generally speaking, if they had a property on Pinckney Street, I think they could see that there's no driveways, you know, so where people, you know.
Well, there's no driveways on places on King George Street either. I mean,
well,
I mean, I guess maybe I shouldn't have been so specific, but take two places that have similar configurations. You know, how do you weigh that?
Well, the questions that are asked are specific to the location. I mean, the person's going to be asked, I'm not sure if it really matters where it is. It's just whether or not they can address the noise and the traffic and the trash. And then somehow it will come up perhaps that there's, you know, maybe 4 others on the street or something like that, possibly in the public hearing. But I think that the special exception criteria is specific enough.
You know, how is traffic for, you know, to say a couple rents a short-term rental and they drive and they have their car? How is that any different than a long-term renter or 2 that have 3 cars? I mean, I'm just having really a hard time seeing how the Board of Appeals is going to do this in a way that's just not arbitrary. And, you know, what I'm kind of worried about here is what it's going to come down to is a squeaky wheel getting the grease. So if you pack the Board of Appeals room with, you know, half of Ward 1 saying, I hate this, you know, that might win the argument versus somebody not, you know, a less squeaky wheel.
What
it's kind of sounding like is, you know, I get you're trying to get some input into sort of provide a hurdle here, but it's just all very arbitrary. That's the problem.
Yeah.
In the absence of any standards beyond this kind of generic stuff that sort of applies to, you know, the fact that there's going to be somebody living there, whether they live there for, you know, a year or a week. You know, they're all going to have cars. They're all going to slam doors. You know, they're going to throw their trash out. I just have a hard time seeing the difference between a rental, short-term rental, long-term rental versus owner with respect to the special exception criteria. It's like you need something specific to non-owner short-term rentals that the Board of Appeals can evaluate. any particular application. I don't see that here.
I would fear of it being too discriminatory. I have faith in the special exception process. I think the requirements are very specific and they specifically address the problems, you know, that we hear from the testimony. I don't know if you have it there. I mean, but it's very specific to the concerns that the neighbors feel, and I don't think it's arbitrary at all. I think it answers all the questions. That's why it's a fair process.
You know, maybe
I think-
Sally, is it possible to get any input from the Board of Appeals or?
That's not a bad idea, because I do feel like some of this is pretty arbitrary and it's not really as objective and the kind of standards that they could use in a useful way. But anyway, I'm sorry, Sally, you were about to say something.
That's okay. You gave me time to think. They don't usually see legislation, but I'd be happy to ask their take on it if they have suggestions. We
You know,
can do that.
I'd be just interested to think, you know, to hear if they're gonna say like, well, how are we gonna decide this?
But what would you suggest because it would be discriminatory, I think, if you went into any other detail, like we don't, you know, does this person have, you know,
Well,
such
so
and such?
if you're asking my opinion about this, maybe it's too early because we're still in the public hearing point, but I think it's incumbent on you as the legislation sponsor to have some objective way of measuring this kind of stuff. I have my opinion. I'm just going to hold it for now because we're in a public hearing testimony, and we'll get to that in our
Yeah.
deliberations.
Well, mine isn't really opinion. I think that the special exception criteria addresses the public testimony sentiments that I heard not only last year, but this year. And it is a very fair vehicle for the owner to present his position that he'll, you know, meet those requirements, but then at the same time, the public to come in and say, you know, not on this street, it's too, you know, it's too condensed, or we have one across whatever, and bring up their concerns.
But how is that any different than having somebody live there as a long-term renter or an owner? You know, they're both going to have cars. They're both going to take the trash out. We're talking about
Usually though, Alex,
particular short-term. What is specific about somebody being there for a weekend that's different with respect to these criteria and the special exception? What's different about somebody being there for a weekend versus living there full
the
time?
house is empty, Alex, for the rest of the week. The grass is.
Show me in the special exception criteria where it talks about being empty.
Yeah, but how do you address that as a criteria? You know,
Well,
empty or
that's
not?
my point. Is it's not in there. I know what you're getting at.
Yeah, but
definitely know what
help
you're
me.
getting
You know,
But-
help- I don't know how
but
you can ask those questions, but
I know
they'll
what you're
come up.
getting at, but there's no way to evaluate what you're getting at. Is the point I'm trying to make.
Well, I've been to special exception hearings and they evolve into other discussions. It isn't, you know, this isn't one size fits all. And I think the Board of Appeals knows that, and they ask, you know, the right questions.
Okay,
You
well,
know,
I mean,
think-
we can, let's just stop. I've
Yeah,
asked my
yeah.
questions, you've answered
Yeah,
them.
I mean, I'm
That's-
open to
let's stop,
suggestions.
Let
but
give other
yeah.
people a chance.
I
not
just don't
let-
want to be discriminatory and say, will you mow your grass when you're not there?
That's fine. I
what do
mean,
you
we
do?
want to hear from the
Yeah.
public too, so I'll
Yep,
stop.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tierney. Any other commissioners have questions of Mr. Tierney while she's here? Okay, and I assume that you're going to be here at the next meeting as well, because obviously this public. And it is 10:03, obviously, and hopefully the planning department was smart enough to realize more than half an hour ago we would not get to any work session involved. So hopefully they dismissed those people a while ago. We do have quite a few comments from the public. Before we go there, any other questions of Ms. Tierney? I want to make sure. Okay, and I can always ask questions later on, but except for these two, or what, if you could say in top three, what you hear from the community about the short-term rentals, if you could sum it up, and I know it's in the evidence that have been provided via testimony, if you could make a quick summary of your top three items that their complaints are, that they're scared of with these short-term rentals. Could you say those? Or just guess a top three?
You're talking to me?
Yes.
I don't know what the top three is. It's like my
Let me take a guess.
folder of testimony here.
No noise from people partying on their porches or whatnot all the time. Lack of care of property, maybe, and parking. Is that what it
I think
is?
that the main one is loss of a neighbor, not having a neighbor. You know, and these are what some of the testimonies said. You know, during the pandemic, my neighbor fed me food. You know, I want neighbors. I want our neighborhood back. I want to have a future neighbor. I want baby strollers.
Whereas me, I want my neighbor not to be there as much
I
as
know.
possible. For a short-term rental, he may not be there as much.
Yeah, but that's you know.
You gain some space in Annapolis. That's hard to get. Okay, but we'll get to those if you want to think about that. But we'll get to. I was just trying to see what were the top three items this was hoping to address for your constituents in those neighborhoods. Obviously, number one is give them a voice to stop any more short-term rentals if things are going around in the street. I think that's probably that gives them ability to go in front of somebody and say, "Hey, look, it's not working out. We don't want any more." That's what I get from you.
Yeah.
And
But I think if I'm testifying, I think the main thing is the limited amount of inventory we have. And every time one of these is taken up by an investor, you lose that opportunity. I mean, we're talking about accessory dwelling units and all sorts of ways of getting housing in there when we have it, and we're basically giving it away to
You're
investors.
changing the dynamics of the neighborhood in time. I get
Yeah,
it.
it
That's
could
the
be
worry.
sold out. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the worry, is you're changing the dynamics of the neighborhood
Yeah.
to something totally different. So being a friendly.
Yeah, they didn't. Here, another one is like, we didn't buy into a hotel. You know, we didn't buy here to live next door to a hotel.
Right. Okay. I'll start displaying some of these public comments and we'll go from there. Everybody take a quick 3-minute recess, use a restroom real quick, and we'll display a couple of those. We will not go past 10:20. We need to end this. Okay. So take a quick 3-minute recess and come back, restroom break, and I'm going to start displaying these public items.
Sure. And, you know, Ben, one of the things you might do while people are taking a break is, for the benefit of the public, is to show people how to get access to all of these, because as Dr. Nash mentioned, they're all in eTrackit. But as anybody who's combed through eTrackit, you know, us nerds who like that kind of thing, know that navigating through eTrackit is a bit of an art form. And so I think if you wanted to take a minute to show people how to do that, it might help, because we refer to that a lot, but people who haven't actually ever done that might not know how, you know, they might stumble around too much and give up. Might be worth showing how to do that, because once you sort of crack the code, it's not hard to do. And what's nice about that is then you have access to every comment that you're going to mention, and people can actually go read them themselves to get a really good flavor of what people are saying.
And I got you. I'm just doing stuff while I'm on mute. I heard everything you said.
Okay.
Thank you. And Julian, do we have the one person who wanted to present still? I believe it's Mr. Marty Etzel. Is he still present?
Yeah, we have two, Marty Etzel and Susan Margile.
And we'll have him go first in 2 minutes when everybody comes
Right.
back.
We had two, Ben. We had a late entrant.
Okay, if we still got them, we'll have them go first.
Okay, yeah, there's there. We do also, there are still some people here for the work session. So all of you that are still here, you're more than welcome to leave. I don't know if you heard that the chair say that we won't be getting to the work session this evening.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, we should have everybody roughly back or close to getting back from the facilities. Mr. Klein will be back soon enough. I'll go ahead and start displaying in another minute. If thank you, Mr. Marty Etzel, we'll go with him being the first to present his situation or his comments, and I'll bring up his. Let's get this here. Let's bring up his comment form. There we go.
Can you guys hear me?
I sure can. Can you hear me?
Yep. I've been here since the very beginning. I was doing a lot of multitasking for the first hour or two.
All right. Well, let's get right to it then. We've got your form and we've seen it all.
Yeah, and I'll address, I'm going to stick to what I had prepared, but I'm going to adjust a little bit based upon the conversation I heard. So first of all, just, thanks to the Planning Commission and Sally Nash for giving us the opportunity to give testimony. I've not attended one of these meetings, so it's been very educational. I'm going to address things from our own perspective. We own a small and surviving traditional bed and breakfast, like House Inn in downtown Annapolis, right downtown on Randall Street. And as we understand the regulation proposed, we strongly oppose it, requiring a transfer or a hearing for the transfer of the rental license. And I'll explain why in a minute. And I had some questions and observations, and some of this was addressed by Alex a few minutes ago. But number one, under the ordinance, can it be explained what a new applicant might expect with regards to the guidelines for approval when it comes to approval? Specifically, if the property's been compliant, whether it's my property or a short-term rental that's owned by a Naval Academy family, selling it on to the next Naval Academy family, if they've been compliant with all the regulations, and Sally read off the whole list, and it's operated without any issues and complaints, can that new property owner expect approval, even if a few neighbors might show up to object purely on the kind of we don't want any more short-term rentals, throw them all out. It's not clear. Alex brought up a lot of good points, the same ones that I'm bringing up. And the only net result is you're going to make it very challenging for new owners to have why would they take on the risk of going in front of a board of appeals with no track record, at least at this point, pay thousands of dollars for lawyers, prepare all sorts of documents, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's very concerning and very unclear how this would happen. That's number one. And Alex, you addressed a lot of this really well. Number two, just for the Planning Commission, do you support this ordinance as the best way to control short-term rentals? And I take it that there's no vote or no conversation or nothing final tonight. I know a lot of the property managers in town that manage a lot of these short-term rentals. We try to stay friendly with them. We try to stay friendly with the neighbors, other bed and breakfasts, even the hotel general managers. And nobody in town objects to having density limits, which was what the traditional bed and breakfast story was back in the 90s, no more than 2 bed and breakfasts per block face. And so nobody's against density limits of a ceiling, and you could do it by block face again, because every neighborhood and every street's a little bit different. So a better solution seems to be designating each block face with some sort of tailored maximum percentage rather than this, which sounds very uncertain how it's going to go. So we oppose the ordinance because in our situation, when we go to sell our bed and breakfast, which could be not that much longer from now, any buyer, they might want to bring in an innkeeper. So it wouldn't be owner occupied, it would be innkeeper occupied, who is not the owner. And for anybody that would be considering to buy our bed and breakfast, which is not cheap in Annapolis, every property is very expensive. They're going to run for the hills because, well, I don't want to go through this approval process. So we would have a lot less potential buyers if somebody would want to install an innkeeper. We have a nice owner quarters here. And so whether it's the owner or whether it's an innkeeper, if they decide to put an innkeeper in and be a silent owner, they won't be interested. And this is going to be the same situation for all these Naval Academy families and whoever these owners of the current short-term rentals are. They're going to find it very challenging to attract other short-term rental buyers to buy the property because of this unclear Board of Appeals hearing process. So we've survived COVID and our business outlook is pretty good, but we might not survive long-term with the passage of this ordinance because the consequences of this is the biggest threat we face. Taken to an extreme, and Alex, you started to point this out too, the appeals process could eliminate all short-term rentals and something that's out of keeping with the historical mixed use of these neighborhoods. All it would take is 3 out of 5 appeal board members and a few aggressive homeowners to show up at every hearing, and all the short-term rentals are gone. And that seems out of touch with the traditional use of this area as a mixed use for short-term, long-term rentals and owners. And I think also long-term, there's a lot of unintended consequences. If all short-term rentals are eliminated, that's a huge amount of rentals that used to be parking in garages and they don't get the parking passes. And all of a sudden there's a flood of people looking that are going to be parking because they're homeowner occupied now rather than parking somewhere off site. And then number two, I think this is a bigger one. If all these short-term rentals were pushed out longer term, just pick a number, 100 short-term rentals, 6 to 10 people in every one every weekend. Where are they going to stay? there going to be bigger hotels built somewhere else? Are they going to stay outside of town, then drive into town to visit their mid? Parking and traffic is going to get worse. So I think there's a lot of unintended consequences if you take the outcome of this to an extreme, which seems to be the intent of to just push out all short-term rentals. So I'm fearing the worst, but I don't have any information to understand or to make me feel better or to make any short-term rental owner feel better that this seems to be something that's going to create a lot of challenges, and at the minimum, a lot of legal cost and time when a property turns over. I could go on. I'd be happy to have a conversation, but I know it's late. We've took over at this property a little over 3 years ago. We've modernized it. We've modernized the marketing. We've gotten great results. We love living here. We're great boosters for all the businesses and attractions downtown. But this just doesn't seem the right way. It's like the wrong solution for the right problem, and the right solution seems to be more like density limits rather than this appeals process. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. And Sally, can you address any, in his case, an existing grandfather clause for his license, and how would that transfer over, if at all, to a new buyer of his property?
Transfers would not be grandfathered.
Right.
Transfer is not grandfathered, but okay. But definitely applicable to his bed and breakfast, the short-term rental legislation. Okay.
But he's owner occupied, so it doesn't affect him. This is for non-owner occupied.
It doesn't affect us now, but when we go to sell, if the new owner wants to put an innkeeper in place and not be owner occupied, it affects us the same way it affects the short-term
Okay.
rental.
Okay, so it limits
It limits my market.
Right.
But again, a property being purchased for profit making instead of community type building neighbor. And you said,
which is what this property's been since 1992.
I got it. What says, you said 6 to 10 people you get?
No. I'm saying like an average short-term rental, any of the ones in the neighborhood will hold 6 to 10 people on average. We have 5 rooms, soon to be 6 as licensed by the city. So call it 10 to 12 in our place. But I'm just kind of throwing out like a back of the napkin calculation.
All right, so this short-term rental is definitely bringing a lot of people in to those residences, those neighborhoods.
I have a quick question, Marty. I was really interested in your comments, and you kept talking about maybe pushing out short-term rentals completely, but you realize that this is just, we're talking about non-owner occupied short-term rentals. We like the idea of having owner occupied, just like you're saying, the way you manage your property now, you live there and all. That's what we want. That's good for the community. So that's what we're talking
but there's if you look at the numbers, and Sally probably has it, I'm pretty sure, and you can cover this the next time, there's very few owner occupied short-term rentals. There's only 3 or 4 traditional bed and breakfasts left in town. There's not many of us. Virtually every short-term rental is a whole house rental. We don't consider them competitors. We list on Airbnb. We get lots of business from Air because people want room at a time. They don't want the whole house. And we do a lot of referrals with the whole house rentals. And it's, some of the whole house rentals get an inquiry for room at a time. I get an inquiry for 4 rooms at a time, and we help each other out.
Got it. Thank you.
Good question, though.
Any other questions from Mr. Etzel? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Etzel. We appreciate
Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah.
Guess what? You're like the Google 50,000 subscriber. You're our first live testimony applicant. And you know what that gets you? Nothing.
I'm so honored. I'd like to thank the Academy for this award.
Hey, we should get a plaque for him and put it on his. I'll never forget you. I appreciate it, Marty. Thank you very much. Really good. Really good. All right, our next live testimony. Let me stop share on that one and go to the next one. Who do we have for live, Chuck?
So Susan Margiles. I'm mispronouncing your last name. I apologize, Susan.
Yes, can you hear me? Everything okay?
And what's your name again?
Yes, so my name is Susan Margulies. I live over at 113 Conduit Street. So I live right in the center of Ward 1. I live right in the center of one of these conservation districts. So I have a lot to say, and I know it's late. I know that I only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to be brief and focused. I am one of the founding members of the Facebook group Support Annapolis STVR, Short-Term Vacation Rentals. We have 318 members, and I've been involved in the process of 02619 and the short-term rental legislation since it happened almost 2 years ago. Within that group and within that community, I speak on behalf of the owner-occupied short-term rentals. I speak on behalf of the people that only rent rooms in their homes or their whole home very occasionally to supplement an annual vacation. So I used to Airbnb my guest room. I don't anymore for reasons that I'm about to explain. So the Planning Commission is obviously concerned about the big picture, the future of short-term rentals in Annapolis. And the question on the table is 0721 the right direction to take short-term rental legislation right now? And my answer as a Ward 1 resident, as a former owner-occupied host is no, this is not the right answer. The first reason is because of all of the things that Marty said and all of the things that Mr. Pline said about the arbitrariness of the Board of Appeals process. And I'd like to give a concrete example of a house on my street. So I live a block and a half from Main Street on Conduit Street. I live in a nice, quiet, dreamy neighborhood. Of course, there are short-term rentals. They are impeccably managed, and I know the property managers very well. They are wonderful neighbors. So I have no issue with short-term rentals on my street. Now, down on Conduit Street, a half a block from Main Street, there was a house. And that house was bought in 2018 for $575K. It has no yard and it has no parking. The resident lived there for 6 months, and then they sold in 2019 for $560K. So they sold quickly, and they sold at a loss. And the reason was, when asked this resident, why did you move? They said, we can't stand living a half a block away from Main Street. There's no parking in our neighborhood. There's noise. There's vomit on our streets and our steps. There are partiers from the bars. We don't want to live here permanently. The person that bought that house uses it as a short-term rental. It is now an impeccable house. It's got beautiful window boxes, and it is populated by out-of-town guests every weekend or every week. Who knows what the rental history on that property is? It is ideally suited to a short-term rental. So if the Planning Commission wants to cut and take away a use, if they want to disallow a class of buyers, you should replace it with something else. What is a $575,000 house with no parking and no yard going to be good for if you can't short-term rent it? My personal answer is subdivide it. Let it become 2 little condos for half the price, and then you might actually get residents in. So the Planning Commission needs to keep in mind the big picture of what is good for Annapolis. And so consider that there are properties in Annapolis that might really only be useful for short-term rentals. The other thing that I have one more thing to say very quickly about owner-occupied Airbnbs. So the reality on the ground right now is quite different from it was back in 2019 when Alderman Arnett first proposed 02619. In particular, Airbnb disallows non-licensed properties. As of February 22nd, 2021, Airbnb will not list any unlicensed property. The problem of regulation with Airbnb is solved. Not only that, but Airbnb collects and remits the hotel tax automatically, both to the city of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County if you're outside the county line. So remember that owner-occupied hosts, people that just rent rooms in their homes, we only use Airbnb. That's the only digital hosting platform out there that allows you to advertise home shares. VRBO doesn't let you do that. VRBO is a luxury whole home rental platform. Owner-occupied hosts only use Airbnb. And so the licensing problem and the taxation collection problem is solved. And the regulations, let's look at the numbers. So if you look at Dr. Nash's staff report, you will see that even host compliance lists, there were 100 owner-occupied properties back in 2020, but there are only 60 now. There's been a 50% reduction, and that's just what Dr. Nash's report shows. And if you look at the 2019 Rockport Analytics study, they showed 502 active listings, but there are only, and Dr. Nash, forgive me if I have this wrong, there are only around 155 licensed properties now. So 350 hosts have dropped off the platforms. And that is because the single homeowners, the widowers, the retirees, the young families who haven't yet turned their guest room into a nursery, the regulations in 02619 are too intrusive. The home inspection that involves the inspection of your private bedroom, your bathroom, are too intrusive. And the 2 tax IDs that you have to get a license are useless because Airbnb collects and remits the taxes. So this is not the right legislation for this time. You should protect your owner-occupied hosts first. That is the moral of my story. And I'm going to stop now because you've given me a lot of time. Thank you very much.
Ms. Margolis, thank you very much. That was actually well packaged and done. So I commend you on your efficiency. And yeah, we did give you a little extra time because you're our number 2 person to testify in person, and that'll get you nothing. But we should get you a plaque. Okay. Commissioners, questions for Ms. Margolis? How do you say that again?
Margulies, and it's perfectly fine. I don't mind. You can really say it any way you want. I'm used to it.
Got it. Anybody have questions for Ms. Margulies? I have a question for you. The neighboring street where that house is on again, you said that was on Conduit, I believe?
Yes, that's correct. It's on Conduit between Duke of Gloucester and Main Street. And it's a beautiful, impeccably maintained short-term rental now. But the resident that lived there found it utterly unsuitable.
Right here. Gotcha.
That's correct. That's correct. And I live a hop, skip, and a jump from there.
And I would bet a lot of the complaints coming to Ms. Tierney's way for this legislation are from maybe over here and other parts of the area. So
by Pinckney and Prince George, I believe.
Yeah. So, and it's almost like one size doesn't fit all here, which is always the case when we hear stuff.
To be clear, the majority of the complaints are for people that just come into town for a night out. The short-term rental, the property managers, by and large, do a good job screening the clients. They're not
Who is that speaking right now?
traditional view of party houses, you know, and these Airbnbs. I don't think that there's all that many complaints.
Okay, I was wondering who that was. Oh, that's Marty. Okay.
Sorry, so yeah, I wasn't booted out the system, so you're stuck with me. Sorry.
Even though you're speaking out of order, but I appreciate it. That's still good information.
So can I just remind us that we're we're not relitigating the entire short-term rental thing. Just to sort of bring the discussion to be really focused here, we're really talking about whether this, you know, the legislation is to make in these zones a special exception, and what conditions what criteria would apply to the awarding of a special exception. And, you know, I mean, we have to sort of keep the scope narrow here, because if we try to revisit the entire short-term rental business of owner-occupied, unowner occupied, I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, those are all interesting discussions, but they're not, we need to stick with what's relevant to this legislation.
So Ms. Margulies,
yes.
This person who moved because of, you know, all the issues that were on that street, was that a family that moved? Because I think
it was a retired couple. It was a retired couple.
I had some friends who lived right on that street, you know, right past the restaurant on that side of the street before you get to Duke of Gloucester. and they had the same issue as well, and they had to move out because of the issues you're talking about. So I can't attest to that.
Yeah, and short-term rentals, they are in for the weekend and they're delighted by the hustle and bustle.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, like I said, I live a block and a half from Main Street, and I bought because I wanted to be within biking distance of my dream job. And when I bought, I absolutely accepted that I was going to be in the middle of hustle and bustle. And that was part of what I was buying. And of course, the short-term rentals around me are impeccably run. And the age of the average guest is 42 years old, just so you know. Airbnb gave us that information at some point, that the average age of the guests in Annapolis was 42.
That's interesting. Okay. Anybody have any other questions for Ms. Margulies? Dave?
No, I said thank you.
Oh, sorry. Saw you light up. Diane?
Nothing.
Okay, Ms. Margulies, thank you very much for your testimony, and Mr. Etzel as well. Very useful. We'll now take you off so you can't chime back in. And congratulations on your number 1 and number 2 participation stats.
Thank you.
We have we have a lot of other testimony, but it's 10:34, and we have seen that we've been provided that as planning commissioners, and we will actually display it at the next meeting for efforts of time tonight. But as you can see, it's quite a long, not too long, but it is a. Let's see if I get that. Okay, it's a list. I'm not going to show the list, but there's about 12, and we've just gone through 2 or 3 of them based on the number from who it's from. Okay, we will continue the public hearing until the next meeting, and Ms. Tierney would love to have you back for that. It's automatic invite, and any other council member. It's automatic invite for any week, any meeting. You don't have to be asked or invited to any commission. You come to anyone you want for any council member.
So that's May 6th.
Yes, that is May 6th. We get 2 weeks before the paint. Actually, the paint will continue tomorrow through May 6th. So
Please, no.
We'll keep doing this, but commissioners are doing a fantastic job. We got a lot done today. The public hearing is over with for tonight, but it's continued to the next meeting on that item. And we will show all of those comments that we've received tonight, but we just didn't get to because of time. And also go into the new ones for next meeting, as well as more debate once we've got all the public comments in. Thank you very much. That's it for that. I will display the agenda. And
good night. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
And
Ms. Tierney.
thank
And
you.
the agenda, next on the agenda is just the fact that we would have adjourned and then had a work session for a new development, but we're obviously not getting that tonight. We have to punt that.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
So thank you very much. Wonderful. I'm talking to it. So I'll second that motion. Any discussion?
I have a quick question. I'd like to try to get on the agenda for our next meeting to make a motion to discuss the change in our conflicts of interest and ex parte communication language.
Yeah, we're getting overtaken by legislation and never getting to that. And if we keep not getting to that, we'll never get to it. So I think we should prioritize that in one of our next meetings.
Okay, and I will talk to Bob Waldman. Gave me some good ideas. He consolidated the language, and the good news is I think the Board of Appeals has been working on this too, and there may be there's some interest in trying to make sure that we all have similar language in terms of these important concepts of conflict of interest.
Excellent. We'll prioritize that for the next meeting, but
So
before
Ben,
we vote.
Ben, it's Jackie. If I might add, the Board of Appeals says we are posting the Board of Appeals draft rules that they for a 30-day period, and they're up on the city website tonight. 30 days actually starts tomorrow. I think several of you had asked when they would be available to review. So they're on the Board of Appeals homepage. There's a link to them.
Jackie, thank you so much. I'll send it around.
Right. Yeah, Diane had asked especially about that. So, and they've been extensively vetted by at least 2 attorneys.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. And before we hold our vote for adjournment, Mr. Tom Smith is here looking very unhappy. What do you have?
No, not unhappy, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to make sure
since you're not hearing the work session tonight, it is postponed until May 6th.
Okay. Do we
That
need
is
to have a
your, that
to
is your
ensure that we
intention?
hear it, do we need to have an
Well, we
internet
have,
intermittent
we
session
have
somewhere?
quite a few items already on the May 6th agenda that may have already been advertised. So I
Well,
think,
this work session was also advertised for
yeah, I
this
understand that,
evening,
Tom, but
and-
I think there like, I'm saying that the work sessions always come at the ends of the meeting. And I think there may be already all this other stuff that's already been advertised that would still be coming before that. So why don't we go over the agenda tomorrow and see, what people have already advertised? Because I think the ads had to go to the paper already for the next meeting.
Since this is a work session, can't we hold it in an intermediate session in between now and the next meeting?
Well, we'd have to get,
it would have to
sometimes very difficult to do that, Ben, just because of,
Yes,
We're
and I
having
really
so many
didn't want the applicant for the work session to bear further expense for further advertising.
well, we can continue it to May 6th and then we can continue it again.
That's
if-
all I was
If
asking.
if we can't, if everything is already filled up before that, I just wanted to, so we can work all of that out by looking at what's already been advertised and has to go on May 6th.
That's fine. We
Simply a
we
question for
don't
the
have to
chairman.
work that out here, do we?
No,
No.
Alex, you can go home now.
Well, these things, we're getting just too much on our agendas. I mean, this is, when I looked at this agenda, I was like, well, good luck getting to that work session. and
Well,
getting
Ben,
very much what I'm putting
we're in a legislative rush period right now because, all the legislation has to be back to council, I think, by June. And you do have, so there's been a lot of legislation introduced to meet that deadline because
Right.
there's a drop dead period in the fall where it all just dies.
And I get that, but my level of sympathy is low. We've had 4 years and, we're trying our damnedest and we're working double time as.
I
it
will
is.
convey your lack of sympathy from your open kimono.
Yes, you can. And we're working as hard as we can, double timing it, and please convey that. So we'll get to it when we can, and everybody here's putting in the time. So as far as getting to that, how do we want to handle that, Tom? We're gonna have to obviously punt it to the next meeting. Is that legal? It's been advertised, and then we get to you before the next items in the next meeting. It's like we're continuing an agenda the next meeting. Does that make sense, Jackie? Tom?
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to make sure that, that we, actually, we can continue it. Then if we don't hear it, we continue it again. And we can work out those details, off the record. But do you still want to prioritize your discussion on conflicts of, the discussion that Diane wants to have for the next meeting? Or is that something that could wait a little while?
Or actually, can we do a 20-minute conversation, not at a meeting, and then
if you're talking about no, you can't do that.
We've got 20 to 30 minutes to broach that item. Let's go ahead and broach it at the next meeting. We can make it happen.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll put it on as a business item.
Yes, and we'll hit it. We'll hit it.
So
We'll
Diane,
hit it-
if you
we'll
could
hit it
just give me a
after.
title on that for the agenda.
will do.
All right,
Okay.
fair enough. And there you go.
Thank you.
That's all I have. There was a motion on the floor and a second with discussion in between. Any other discussion on the motion of adjournment? All right, all those in favor say aye.
I would just like to
Aye.
comment that Tom Smith has a tie on at 10:30 at night.
Oh, for God's sakes. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Now it's-
All those opposed, any abstentions? The meeting is now